The wind came first, then the snow, then the scream that did not belong to the storm. Across the Montana Territory, a blizzard buried everything in white. Cattle turned their backs. Birds fell silent. Beneath a fallen cottonwood, something enormous struggled under the trunk. A lone rider heard it. Against every instinct to seek shelter, he rode toward the sound. Snow needled his face. His horse fought the bit. The scream came again, raw, furious, human. He found her pinned, leg broken, built on a scale the world had never made room for. He could have turned away. He did not. The tree groaned. The storm howled. Two fates began to twist together. Montana Territory, November 1881. The wind came off the ridge first, before the snow. Before anything. Gideon Cross felt it against the back of his neck like a hand pressing down, telling him to turn around, telling him a man with sense would already be riding for shelter. He wasn't a man with sense. Not that day. He was a man with 9 strays somewhere in the breaks below Black Alder Creek, and a foreman, back at the date outfit, who didn't care one bit about weather when it came to counting cattle at the end of the month. So he kept riding. Because that's what you did. You kept riding until the job was done or the job killed you, and out here those two things weren't always different from each other. The sky had gone the color of a bruise an hour back. Purple-gray, low, pressing down over the basin like a lid closing on a pot. By the time the first flakes hit his collar, they were needles. Sideways, driven hard enough to sting through wool. The basin itself seemed to know what was coming before Gideon did. Cattle he'd passed an hour back had already turned tail toward whatever low ground they could find, backs to the wind, heads down, the particular stillness of animals who trust their instincts over any man's judgment. Birds had gone quiet. Even the creek, usually loud enough this time of year to hear from a quarter-mile off, had gone strangely muffled, its voice swallowed by a silence that felt less like peace and more like the world holding its breath. Gideon had ridden through plenty of storms, had learned, the hard way, more than once, exactly how fast a Montana sky could turn from merely unpleasant to genuinely lethal. But there was something about this one, some weight to the air, some particular color to that bruised horizon that had him checking his cinch twice, checking his rifle load, checking the position of a sun that had already all but vanished behind the coming wall of gray, which was probably why he should have turned back the second the wind found his collar, which was exactly why he didn't. His horse, a sorrel gelding named Ruin, for reasons Gideon had stopped explaining to people, fought the bit twice, wanted to turn tail, wanted to run for the nearest tree line and stand there shivering until it passed. Gideon didn't blame him. He held the reins anyway, because somewhere out in that white was 9 head of cattle that belonged to a man who'd fire him without blinking, and because Gideon Cross had exactly $40 to his name and a saddle that needed new leather and nothing else in this world he could call his. No house, no wife, no family waiting on a porch, just cattle that weren't his in weather that wanted to kill him for wages he'd probably spend within a week of getting paid. That was the whole of it. That was the life he'd built. One long ride from nowhere to nowhere, and he'd told himself for years he liked it that way. He almost believed it most days, until the wind screamed. Not the storm. Something under the storm, a sound that didn't belong to weather at all, raw and low and furious, cutting through the howling wind like a blade through canvas. Gideon's hand went to the rifle scabbard before his mind caught up to the reflex. A bear, maybe. Except bears didn't sound like that. Not in November. Not with the ground already freezing solid and every sensible animal already denned up for the winter. Except this wasn't a growl, it was a voice. He sat his horse for one long second, snow needling his face, and told himself to ride the other way. Told himself a man alone in a blizzard chasing strange sounds was a man who ended up dead by morning. Another name added to the list the basin kept quietly, year after year, in shallow graves nobody visited. He rode toward it anyway, because that was the other thing about Gideon Cross. He could talk himself into leaving. He'd left more places than he could count, more people, more half-built lives he'd abandoned before they finished being built. But he had never once in 34 years managed to ride away from a sound like that. The gelding fought him again at the tree line, stand of cottonwoods bent nearly sideways under the wind, black bones against the white, and this time Gideon didn't argue. He swung down, boots sinking to the ankle, and led the horse forward on foot, one glove pressed to his own face just to keep breathing. The sound came again, closer now, and under it, something else. A word maybe, broken in half by pain. He found her at the base of a fallen cottonwood, one that the wind must have taken down not an hour before, judging by the raw pale wood still bleeding sap into the snow. The trunk lay across the drift at an angle, and beneath it Gideon stopped walking. He stopped breathing too, for a second that felt longer than it was, because the woman pinned beneath that tree was not a woman the size the world expected women to be. She was enormous, not heavy, long-limbed, long back, built on a scale that made the fallen cottonwood look almost reasonable in comparison, like the tree had simply misjudged its opponent. Her boot, one boot, the size of a feed sack, was jammed against a root the tree had torn loose from the frozen ground, and her leg beneath the trunk bent in a way that made Gideon's stomach turn even from 20 feet off. She had stopped screaming. She was breathing hard through her teeth instead, fists clenched in the snow, dark hair plastered flat and wild across her face, and when she heard his boots crunching closer she went still. Not frightened still, braced still. The kind of stillness Gideon had only ever seen in men, waiting to see if a fight was about to get worse. She said. Her voice came out rough, but it carried. It carried the way a voice does when it belongs to someone who has never once in her life needed to raise it to be heard. Whatever you're thinking, don't. Gideon crouched a few feet from her, keeping his hands where she could see them, the way he might with a spooked horse. I'm thinking you've got a tree on your leg. I'm thinking you're about to run. I'm not running. They always run. Her jaw was tight. Blood had frozen dark along one side of her face, or something, a branch maybe, or the fault itself had opened a cut above her brow, or they scream, or they stand there like you're doing right now, deciding whether I'm real. Gideon looked at her another second. At the size of her hands, the size of her shoulders, the storm screaming around both of them like it had opinions of its own. You're real, he said. You're also freezing, and that leg's not getting any better while we talk about it. Something in her face shifted. Not trust. Not yet, but a small crack in the bracing. It's broken, she said. I know how it feels broken. It's broken. Then we need to get that tree off it before your blood does. We, she repeated, like the word tasted strange in her mouth. He didn't answer that. He was already moving, already sizing up the trunk thick as a barrel, heavier than anything one man should try alone, heavier than anything two men his size should try alone, except there was no choice in a blizzard except the choice you made, which meant leverage, which meant the fence rail lying half buried 6 feet off, torn loose from wherever it had once stood, probably ripped free by the same gust that had taken the tree down. He grabbed it, jammed one end under the trunk, threw his whole weight against the other. The tree didn't move. That's not going to work, she said. Working on it. You're 160 pounds soaking wet. That tree weighs more than your horse. You want to help, or you want to keep telling me math? For a second, one strange suspended second in the middle of a killing storm, something almost like a laugh cracked through her clenched jaw. Bitter. Short, but real. Fine, she said. Wedge it lower, under the split, not the trunk. And put your back into it this time, cowboy, because I'd rather lose the leg clean than have you half do the job. He wedged it lower. She was right. The trunk gave just enough, just a groaning inch, and she dragged her leg free, with a sound that made Gideon's teeth ache in sympathy. But she didn't scream this time. She went white. She went silent. She pressed both massive hands flat into the snow and breathed through it like a woman used to enduring things alone. Okay, Gideon said, kneeling beside her, snow already burying both of them to the knee. Okay, now the hard part, which is getting you somewhere warm before that leg decides it doesn't like being outside a socket. She looked at him then. Really looked, for the first time, not with suspicion, not with the braced for a fight stillness from before, but with something rawer, something that looked almost like disbelief, like she was waiting for the part where this went the way it always went. You know I can't ride behind you on that horse, she said, not without breaking it in half. I know. So what's your plan, exactly? Gideon looked at Ruin, standing miserable and blowing steam 20 feet off. Looked at the trunk, looked at the fence rail he'd just used as a lever, and the torn canvas tarp, caught half buried under a drift nearby, probably blown loose from someone's wagon load weeks ago, snagged on brush, forgotten. You're going to hate it, he said. I already hate most of today. Try me. He dragged the canvas free, laid it out flat beside her. I can't carry you, I can't lift you, but I can drag you if you'll let me, and if there's shelter close enough that dragging gets us there, before we both freeze solid. She was quiet a moment. The wind screamed between them, filling the silence with something almost merciful. "There's a cabin," she said finally. "Mine. Half a mile, maybe less, past that ridge. Then that's the plan. You're going to drag a woman my size half a mile through a blizzard. Looks that way. You'll be dead of exhaustion before we're halfway there." Gideon almost smiled. "Almost. Ma'am, I've spent 6 years chasing cattle through weather that wanted to kill me for wages that wouldn't buy a decent hat. I think I can manage half a mile." She studied him a long moment, studied him the way a person studies a stranger's face for a lie, and finding none, exhaled something that wasn't quite relief. "Juniper," she said. "My name's Juniper Larkin. In case you're dragging a woman half a mile through a blizzard, you ought to at least know her name. Gideon Cross." He got the canvas positioned beneath her, wincing at the way her injured leg dragged, at the sounds she was biting back. "Pleasure, Miss Larkin. Wish it were under better circumstances. Everyone always does." He didn't ask what that meant. Not yet. There'd be time for questions once they weren't both about to die of cold. The half mile took the better part of an hour. Gideon would remember it later, much later, long after that winter had become a story he told himself in the quiet hours, as the hardest hour of his life, and not because of the weight, though God knew the weight was real. It was hard because of the wind, which seemed determined to take something from both of them before they reached shelter. It was hard because Ruin kept fighting the lead rope, kept wanting to bolt, and Gideon had to keep one fist knotted in the reins the whole way, hauling horse and canvas and woman all at once through drifts that came up past his knees. It was hard, too, because every few hundred feet Juniper Larkin would go rigid on the canvas and say, through gritted teeth, "Leave me. Get to shelter yourself. I'll manage." And every time Gideon said the same thing back. No. Just that. No explanation. No argument. He didn't have the breath to spare for argument. Dragging her weight through snow that fought him for every inch, but even if he'd had breath to spare, he wasn't sure he could have explained it any better than that single word. No. Because something in him, something old, something that had nothing to do with wages or cattle or the $40 in his pocket, had already decided this wasn't a woman he was leaving in the snow. Not today, not ever, if he had any say in it. Which was a strange thing to feel about a stranger he'd known for 40 minutes. He didn't examine it too closely. There wasn't time. Halfway through that hour, though neither of them could have said for certain because distance had stopped meaning anything the way it usually did. Ruin spooked. A gust caught the canvas wrong, snapped it hard enough to crack like a whip, and the sound was enough. The gelding reared, screamed his own thin animal scream into the wind, and bolted sideways into the white before Gideon's numb fingers could tighten on the lead rope. "Gideon, stay put." He was already moving, already chasing a horse he could barely see, boots punching through drift after drift, heart slamming a rhythm that had nothing to do with cold. Because if Ruin ran far enough, if the rope tangled or the gelding went down in some hidden gully, that was the end of it. That was 2 people left to die in a blizzard instead of 1. He caught the trailing rope 40 feet on, wrapped it twice around his fist, hauled the animal's head down hard enough to make his own shoulders scream in protest, and stood there a moment, chest heaving, snow filling every gap in his collar, before he trusted himself to turn around. Juniper hadn't moved, hadn't called out again. She lay exactly where he'd left her, canvas half buried already, face turned up into the wind like she was daring it to do its worst. "You didn't run," Gideon said, dragging the horse back toward her, voice rough with something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite anger either. "Told you. I don't run. Never have the option to. Built like this world doesn't exactly let a woman my size disappear into a crowd." A humorless huff barely audible under the wind. "Besides, you'd have come back for the horse either way. Figured I'd rather be found beside you than found alone. That's supposed to be comforting? That's supposed to be honest. Now get me up before the cold finishes what the tree started." The cabin appeared through the white, like something conjured low, squat, smoke-scared timber, standing defiant against a wind that seemed personally offended by its existence. A barn stood off to one side, listing slightly, and beyond it a scatter of shapes that might have been cattle huddled tight against a windbreak of brush and old fence rail. "There," Juniper gasped, and it was the first time her voice had cracked since he found her. "There, that's home. Get me to the door." He got her to the door. Getting her through it was another matter entirely. The frame had been built, Gideon realized with a jolt of understanding, for a man of ordinary size, which meant it had never once been built to accommodate the woman now, sprawled half-frozen across his canvas sled, and, for one terrible, Absurd moment in the howling dark, Gideon Cross found himself laughing. Actually laughing. Snow crusting his eyelashes, hands numb past feeling, laughing, because there was nothing else left in him to do. What Juniper said flat is funny. Nothing. Everything. We just walked half a mile through a blizzard and now I can't get you through your own front door. There's a wider gate. Barn side, my father built it. She stopped. Something crossed her face, fast and dark, gone before Gideon could name it. There's a wider gate, barn side. You built this door for a normal-sized man, Gideon said, hauling her sideways, canvas scraping against the frame. Man your father's size, maybe. My father was 5'6" and proud of every inch. Explains a lot. Explains why I've been ducking through my own house since I was 14 years old, Cowboy. So don't act like you've discovered something clever. Didn't say clever. Said inconvenient. Everything about me is inconvenient. You'll learn that quick enough if you stick around. Something in the way she said it flat, rehearsed, like a line she'd delivered 100 times to 100 different people who'd all eventually proven her right, made Gideon pause even mid-haul, snow stinging his eyes, arms burning. Or, he said, I'll learn you built a wider gate on the barn side so you'd never have to duck for anybody. That sounds less like inconvenient, and more like a woman who solves her own problems. Juniper didn't answer that, but something in her jaw loosened, just slightly, just enough for Gideon to notice even through the storm. He hauled her there instead. Got her through, finally, into a darkness that smelled of cold ash and dust, and something that might have once been coffee, and the second the door shut behind them, the wind's scream dropped to a muffled roar, and Gideon Cross stood there in the sudden quiet, chest heaving, arm shaking, staring at the woman he'd just dragged half a mile through a killing storm. She was staring back. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Juniper said, Lo, you should get the fire going before you worry about me. I've survived worse than a broken leg. You look like you're about to fall over. I'm fine. You're the color of a dead fish. You're bossy for someone who was screaming under a tree 20 minutes ago. Something flickered across her face, surprise. Maybe that he'd said it, that he'd talked back instead of tiptoeing. And then, unexpectedly, that same short, bitter laugh from before. Warmer this time. Fire, she said now. Argue with me later, Cowboy. He got the fire going. It took longer than it should have, his hands clumsy with cold, flint scraping uselessly twice before the kindling finally caught, and by the time flame climbed up through the dry wood and threw its first orange light across the room, Gideon had a moment, just a moment, to actually look at where he'd landed. The cabin was small. One main room, a stove, a table, a bed built low against the far wall built low. He understood now, because it had to be, to hold the woman who'd own it. But it wasn't the size of things that caught him. It was the stillness. A man's coat hung from a peg by the door, undisturbed, dusted faintly with the kind of dust that only settles when nobody's touched a thing in weeks. A mug sat on a shelf near the stove, empty, exactly where someone had left it. A chair by the hearth sat angled toward the door, not toward the fire, not toward anything useful, just toward the door, like it was waiting for someone to walk back through it. An auger rested on the workbench along the wall, untouched, waiting. Gideon didn't ask. He didn't have to. Some rooms told you everything without a single word. This one told him a story he recognized instantly, because he'd built one just like it himself once, years ago, in a house he'd walked out of and never spoken of since. This was a room built around an absence. Juniper had gone quiet behind him, watching him take it in, and when he finally turned back to her, she was already looking away toward the wall. Toward nothing, her jaw set in that same braced line from the storm. My father, she said before he could ask. September. 2 months back. A pause. The chair faces the door because I haven't moved it. That's all. Don't make it into something. I wasn't going to. You were thinking it. I was thinking your leg needs looking at before you bleed through that trouser leg any worse than it already has. She glanced down, startled, as if she'd forgotten the injury entirely in this strange collision of storm and stranger and grief, all crowding the same small room. Blood had indeed soaked dark through the fabric at her thigh, spreading slow across denim gone stiff with cold. Oh, she said, quietly. That. Yeah, that. I don't. She stopped. Started again. I don't usually let people tend to me. I don't usually drag people half a mile through a blizzard. Seems like tonight's a night for firsts. Something in her face softened, just barely, just at the edges, and for the first time since he'd found her under that tree, Gideon Cross saw not the braced stranger, Not the woman waiting for the world to flinch at her, but something closer to the truth of her, tired, in pain. And, underneath all of it, cautiously, dangerously close to letting a stranger help. "All right," she said, "do what you have to do. But, Cowboy, yeah? If you flinch, if your face does that thing men's faces do, I want you gone before morning, storm or no storm, I mean it." Gideon met her eyes across the firelight, steady. "I already saw you," he said, "under that tree, screaming into a blizzard, refusing to leave your cattle out there even half-conscious with a broken leg, because that's what you were doing, wasn't it, when the tree came down? Checking on your stock in a storm nobody sane would go out in." Her silence was answer enough. "I'm not flinching at anything after that," he said. "Now hold still. This is gonna hurt." It did hurt. She didn't scream again, though not once. He was through the whole business of cutting the frozen fabric away, of washing the wound with water heated slow on the stove, of splinting a leg that had no business fitting on any splint Gideon had ever built for an ordinary-sized man, which meant he had to improvise with fence board and rawhide strips and more prayer than skill. She gritted her teeth. She gripped the edge of the low bed hard enough to leave marks. And once, only once, when he pulled the splint tight, a sound tore loose from her that she clearly hadn't meant to let escape. "Sorry," Gideon muttered. "Don't apologize. Finish it." He finished it. By the time he sat back, hands trembling with cold and effort both, the fire had climbed to something like real warmth, and outside the wind still screamed its endless argument against the walls. But inside, for the first time since he'd heard that sound in the storm, Gideon let himself breathe. Juniper lay back against the low bed, eyes closed, breathing hard but steady. "Thank you," she said. Rough, reluctant, almost like the words cost her something to spend. "You're welcome. I mean it." Most people, she stopped herself again, started over, slower this time. Most people in this basin cross the street rather than look at me straight, and you just spent an hour dragging me through a blizzard and didn't say one word about it. Not one. Didn't seem worth mentioning. Everybody mentions it. Gideon shrugged, easing himself down onto the floor near the stove, too worn to manage anything more graceful. "I've been called worse things than tall, by better people than whoever's been crossing your street." That earned him the laugh again. Small, surprised out of her, like she hadn't expected to have one left in her tonight. "You're strange, Gideon Cross." Been told that too. There was, Gideon discovered somewhere past midnight, a particular comedy to sharing one small cabin with a woman built on a scale the cabin had never once accounted for. The bed, low as it was, still left her hanging full foot past the frame's edge by the time she finally lay back to rest. Blanket riding up no matter how she arranged it, and Gideon caught her scowling at her own toes in the firelight like they'd personally betrayed her. Something wrong. "Blanket's too short. Has been for years. I keep meaning to piece together a longer one and never quite get to it. You've got a whole trunk of quilts over there. None of them fit. Nothing in this basin fits, Cowboy. That's rather the point of me." Gideon looked at the trunk, looked at her feet, bare now, sticking a full 12 inches past the blanket's edge into the cold. Looked at the 2 spare quilts folded on the shelf, and then, because some problems just needed a person willing to look at them sideways, got up, dragged a low bench over from beside the door, and laid the spare quilts across it, extending the bed's effective length by another 2 feet. "There," he said, straightening up. "Problem solved." Juniper stared at the makeshift extension a long moment, stared at him. "You just," she said slowly, "built me a longer bed. In the middle of a blizzard. Using a bench and some spare quilts seemed easier than listening to you complain about cold feet for 3 more days. I wasn't complaining. You were scowling at your own toes like they owed you money." Something in her face cracked open, then not the careful smile from before, not the short bitter laugh, but something bigger, something that started somewhere deep in her chest and came out as a real, full, startled laugh that filled the whole cabin and seemed to surprise nobody more than Juniper herself. "Nobody's ever done that," she said, once she'd caught her breath. 19 years of cold feet, and not one single person ever thought to just fix it. My father would have meant to. Never quite got around to it, same as the springboks, same as 100 other things a body means to do and never does. She looked at the bench, at the quilts, at the strange makeshift solution, to a problem she'd apparently decided long ago wasn't worth solving. You just did it, like it wasn't even a decision, wasn't much of one. Man doesn't need a law degree to see a woman's feet hanging off the end of her own bed. Most men wouldn't see it at all. or they'd see it and decide it wasn't their business to fix. Well, Gideon settled back down near the stove, feeling something warm settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. I told you already, I'm not most men that keep being right about it. Juniper shook her head, but she was smiling, really smiling, unguarded. The kind of smile Gideon suspected the town of Judith Basin had never once been given the privilege of seeing, and settled back onto her newly extended bed with a contentment that hadn't been there an hour before. "Good night, Cowboy," she said. "Good night, Miss Larkin." Outside, the storm showed no sign of tiring. If anything, it seemed to be settling in, digging its claws deeper into the basin with every passing hour, and Gideon understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a man once the adrenaline finally drains out of him, that he wasn't going anywhere tonight. Wasn't going anywhere tomorrow either, most likely. He didn't mind. Which surprised him more than anything else that whole strange day. Night came down hard and early, the way it always did in November, and the cabin filled with the small sounds of two strangers learning how to exist in one room. Gideon banked the fire. Juniper directed him, voice thin with pain but sharp as ever, toward the root cellar, toward dried meat and a sack of coffee, toward a kettle that had clearly not been used in longer than she wanted to admit. "You don't eat much," Gideon observed, setting a meager supper between them. "I eat plenty. I just don't cook much." Not since. She didn't finish that sentence either. She'd left 3 of them unfinished tonight already, each one trailing off into the same silent shape. Gideon let it go. Some doors, a man learns, don't open for pushing. They open on their own time if they open at all, and rushing them only makes them slam harder. They ate in near silence. The fire popped. The wind screamed. And somewhere in the middle of that silence, Gideon found himself studying her, not her size. Not anymore. That particular shock had already burned itself out somewhere on the trail back to the cabin, but her hands. Scarred. Calloused. A working woman's hands. Rope-burned and sun-browned. Despite the season, hands that had clearly spent years doing every hard thing a ranch demanded without once waiting for help that never came. "You run this place alone," he said. "Not quite a question. I run this place alone. Since your father, since before that, if I'm honest." Her eyes went to the fire. "He got sick toward the end. Slow. I was doing most of it myself for months before September ever came. That's a lot of ranch for one person. It's a lot of ranch for one person my size." A dry, humorless edge crept into her voice. "Funny thing about being built like this, Cowboy. Everyone assumes it makes the work easy. Assumes I can just haul and lift and carry like some kind of draft animal they don't have to pay wages to." She looked at him, something fierce and tired behind her eyes. "Nobody assumes I might get tired, might get lonely, might want just once for somebody to look at me and see a person instead of a curiosity." She was quiet a moment, staring into the fire like it held an old argument she'd had 100 times and never once won. "There was a man," she said finally. "Came through when I was 16. Stood outside the fence for near an hour just watching me split wood, like I was a thing at a county fair he hadn't paid to see yet. My father ran him off with a shotgun he never once loaded. Didn't need to load it. Man saw the look on Amos Larkin's face and decided the risk wasn't worth it. What'd he want? Wanted to know what I'd charge to stand in attendance." Her voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone brittle, the way ice goes brittle right before it cracks clean through. "Told my father I could make more money in a season standing still than the ranch made in 5 years working. Called it an opportunity. Called me an opportunity, actually, not even a person by that point in the conversation. He came back. Different men, different years. Same offer, more or less, dressed up different each time." She looked at Gideon then, something guarded and testing in her eyes, like she was watching for the flinch she'd warned him about. "That's the thing nobody tells you about being built like I am, Cowboy. It's not the staring that wears you down. Staring I can live with. It's the arithmetic. Every stranger who walks onto this land doing sums in their head how much I'm worth, not as a rancher, not as a person, but as a spectacle. Like my whole life's just waiting to be somebody's prophet." I wasn't doing sums. No, something almost gentle crossed her face, quick gone before it could settle. "You were doing math about tree weight and horsepower. Different kind of sums entirely." Gideon didn't answer right away. Because there wasn't a fast answer for something like that. Because anything quick would have sounded cheap, and she deserved better than cheap. Not after the day she'd had, not after the years he was only just beginning to understand she'd had. "I saw a person," he said finally, "under that tree. That's all I saw." She looked at him a long moment. The fire cracked between them, throwing shifting light across her face, across the scar above her brow he'd cleaned an hour before, across eyes that had clearly decided, a long time back, not to expect kindness from strangers. "We'll see if that's still true come morning," she said. Guarded. But not cold, not anymore. "We will," Gideon agreed, and settled back against the wall to wait out the storm. The second day dawned white and furious, the blizzard showing no mercy, no sign of breaking, and Gideon woke stiff and cold on the cabin floor, to the sound of Juniper already moving, dragging herself upright against the low bed frame, jaw set, sweat beading despite the cold, as she tried to put weight on a leg that had no business bearing any weight at all. "What," Gideon said, sitting up fast, "do you think you're doing, Impa? Cattle need checking. Your leg is broken. My cattle don't care." She gripped the bed frame, breathing hard through the effort, and something in her expression dared him to argue further. "They're huddled against the windbreak, but if that fence gives, if they scatter into open ground in this, then I'll check them." That stopped her. Actually stopped her, mid-motion, one hand still braced white-knuckled against the frame. "You don't know this ranch," she said. "No. But I know cattle, and I know weather, and I know a woman with a broken leg has no business walking to a barn in a blizzard, when there's a man sitting right here who can do it for her. I know you don't need it," Gideon said, already pulling his boots on, already reaching for his coat, still stiff with yesterday's frost. "You've made that plenty clear. Doesn't mean you can't have it anyway." She stared at him, and for once, for the first since he'd met her, screaming under a fallen tree in the middle of the worst storm the basin had seen in years, Juniper Larkin didn't have a sharp answer ready. "There's rope by the door," she said finally, low. "String it barn to house before you go. Wind like this, a man can lose the cabin in 10 feet of snow and freeze 20 steps from his own front door. You sound like you've seen it happen." "I've seen it happen to smarter men than you, cowboy." Gideon almost smiled. Strung the rope anyway. Went out into a wind that hit him like a wall the moment he cleared the door. Snow already 3 feet deep in the drifts between cabin and barn, visibility reduced to nothing but white in every direction, except for the thin lifeline of rope guiding his hand forward. He found the cattle huddled tight, as she'd said, pressed flat against a windbreak of brush and broken fence. And it was there, working his way along that fence line, checking for weak points, that his glove brushed across something carved into the wood. A brand, burned deep into a fence rail that had clearly been salvaged from somewhere else entirely, repurposed into this ranch's boundary, the way frontier ranches often stitched themselves together out of whatever timber came to hand. He didn't recognize it exactly. A shape half buried under frost and old weathering. Something like a diamond crossed through, but the storm was screaming, and his fingers were going numb, and Juniper's cattle needed moved to a tighter cover before the wind found its way through the gaps. And so Gideon filed the brand away in some back corner of his mind, the way a man files away 100 small strange things on 100 ordinary days, and went back to work. It would be months before he thought of it again. By the time he made it back to the cabin, half frozen, half blind from snow crusted thick on his lashes, Juniper had somehow managed, despite the leg, despite his instructions, despite everything, to drag herself upright and get the fire built higher, coffee going on the stove. And when he stumbled through the door, she looked at him with an expression caught somewhere between relief and fresh irritation. "You were gone 40 minutes. Cattle needed moving. You could have died out there. You could have stayed off that leg." They stared at each other, both breathing hard, both stubborn past the point of sense, and then unexpectedly, gloriously, Juniper laughed. A real laugh this time, loud, surprised, filling the small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "We're a matched pair, aren't we?" she said. "Both too stubborn to survive our own good sense. Looks that way. My father used to say stubbornness was the only crop that never failed in this basin." Her smile faded, slow, into something quieter, sadder. "He'd have liked you, I think. For what that's worth." "It's worth a lot," Gideon said, and meant it more than he expected to. The days that followed blurred into each other, storm-bound and strange, the two of them learning the particular rhythm of survival, shared between people who hadn't chosen each other but couldn't yet leave. Gideon tended the stock, twice daily, rope guided through blinding white. Juniper, despite every order he gave her, refused to stay fully off her feet, directing him instead from a chair dragged close to the stove, calling out instructions about the spring box, about hay rationing, about which drafts in the walls needed stuffing with wool before the cold found its way to bone. Mornings took on a shape neither of them had asked for, but both of them, without quite admitting it out loud, settled into like an old boot finally worn to the correct shape of a foot. Gideon woke first, always some habit worn into him by years of trail work, of needing to be saddled and moving before the sun fully cleared the horizon, and spent those quiet gray minutes rebuilding the fire before Juniper stirred. She woke slower. Woke fighting the leg for the first several minutes of every day. Jot, refusing help until the worst of the stiffness worked itself loose, and Gideon learned quick not to offer a hand during those minutes. Learned to simply have coffee ready by the time she was ready to accept it. You don't have to do that, she told him, the second morning, watching him pour. I know, most men would make a woman ask. Then it's a good thing I'm not keeping score. That's not an answer either, Cowboy. But she took the coffee anyway, and Gideon noticed because by then he'd started noticing small things about her, the way a man notices weather shifting before he can name exactly what's changed, that her shoulders came down half an inch when she did. The blizzard outside showed no interest in their small domestic truce. It screamed on, day into night into day again, burying the world in white until the windows went dark with drift, and the only proof the sun still existed was a faint gray brightening behind the shutters each morning, gone again by mid-afternoon. Gideon made his rope-guided trips to the barn twice daily, sometimes 3 times, checking water, checking hay, checking the fence line for weak spots the wind kept finding, no matter how many times he shored them up. Juniper, despite the leg, found her own ways to be useful. She mended tack from the chair by the fire, big hands moving with a precision that surprised him every time he watched them work awls, and needles that looked comically small against fingers built for hauling fence posts, and yet she threaded them without a single wasted motion. She's talked him through the ranch's whole operation while he worked, unprompted mostly, like the talking itself was a kind of relief after years of having nobody to explain any of it to. Springboks needs deepening before next winter, she said on one of those long gray afternoons. Father kept meaning to get to it. Never did. Now it's mine to get to. And I will. This leg cooperates. I could help with that. Once the road's clear. You'll be back at the date outfit by then, chasing somebody else's cattle. Maybe. Gideon turned that over a moment, surprised by how little he liked the shape of it. Maybe not. Juniper looked up from her stitching at that. Something careful crossing her face, not quite hope. Because hope was a dangerous thing to let show, he was learning. For a woman who'd spent her whole life having it disappointed. But something close to it, something adjacent. Don't say things you don't mean, Cowboy, she said. I've had enough men say things they didn't mean to last 3 lifetimes. I don't say things I don't mean. Ask anybody who's ever fired me for saying exactly what I thought at exactly the wrong moment. That got the laugh out of her again, quick, surprised, gone as fast as it came, but real every single time. And Gideon had started, somewhere in the last 2 days, to count those laughs the way a man counts anything rare and worth counting. It was on the second night that the barn nearly took the whole thing down with it. Gideon heard the crack before he understood what it meant, a groan of old timber giving way somewhere out past the rope line, sharp enough to cut through even the wind's constant howling, and Juniper, half dozing by the fire, came awake instantly, eyes going wide and clear the way they only did when something threatened the animals. North wall, she said. That's the north wall. It's been weeks since spring. I kept meaning to brace it properly. She was already dragging herself up, already reaching for the crutch, and this time Gideon didn't argue with her about staying put, because arguing would waste time neither of them had. Tell me what to grab. Spare fence board. Behind the grain sacks. I'll find it. They went out into a wind that had, if anything, gotten worse, and found the barn's north wall bowed inward under a drift that had built up faster than either of them had accounted for. One support post cracked clean through at the base, timber groaning under the weight of snow packed hard against it from outside. The cattle inside had crowded away from the failing wall, pressed tight against the far corner, breath steaming thick in the dark. If that post goes, Juniper shouted over the wind, the whole wall comes down on top of them. Then it doesn't go. He wedged the spare board against the cracked post, angled the way she directed, driving nails home with a mallet in hands gone half numb, and it should have held, would have held, if the wind hadn't chosen that exact moment to slam a fresh gust, hard enough to shift the whole structure sideways, hard enough to knock Gideon off balance, hard enough to send him stumbling directly into the path of a support beam, already groaning toward collapse. He didn't see it coming. Didn't have time to. Juniper did. She moved faster than a woman with a splinted leg had any right to move, one massive arm shooting out, closing around his shoulder, and hauling him backward with a strength that lifted him clean off his feet for half a second. Clean out of the beam's path, a heartbeat, before it gave way entirely and crashed down into the space where he'd just been standing. Snow and splinters and the ringing aftermath of near disaster settled around them both. Gideon lay half sprawled against her, breathing hard, staring up at a woman who'd just saved his life on a leg that shouldn't have been bearing weight at all. He started. Don't, Juniper said. But there was no heat in it this time. None of the old bracing. Just breathless disbelief matching his own. Don't you dare thank me. I did the math wrong on that beam 3 months ago and nearly got you killed for it. That's not heroics, Cowboy. That's just cleaning up my own mess. Felt like heroics from where I was standing. You weren't standing. You were about to be flattened. Something passed between them, then quick, wordless. The particular current that runs between two people who've just watched death come close and veer away at the last possible second. Gideon didn't move. Didn't quite trust himself to, with her arm still braced hard across his chest, her breath coming fast against his ear. We should brace the other post, he said finally, voice rougher than he meant it to be. Before it decides to join the first one. Yes, Juniper agreed. Didn't move either, not right away. We should. Neither of them moved for 1 more second. Then 2. Then the wind screamed again, and the moment broke, and they got back to work. By the time they'd finished post-reset, wall-braced, cattle settled and steaming quiet in the dark, both of them were soaked through and shaking with cold and something that wasn't entirely cold, and the walk back to the cabin along the rope line passed in a silence that felt different from every silence that had come before it. Not tense, not guarded, just full of something neither one of them was ready yet to name. Back inside, firelight steadying the shake out of both their hands. Gideon noticed the blood before Juniper did a thin line at her temple, where a flying splinter must have caught her during the worst of the collapse, dark against pale skin, and when he reached to check it, she flinched back on pure reflex. Sorry, she stuttered. Habit. Old head. People don't usually reach toward me expecting to touch gentle. I'm not people. You keep saying that too. Keep being true. He cleaned the small cut with careful, unhurried hands, the same steady patience he'd used on her leg the first night, and this time Juniper didn't flinch again, didn't brace, just watched him work with an expression. Gideon couldn't quite name something between disbelief and a cautious, dangerous kind of gratitude. You've got gentle hands for a man who spends his days wrestling cattle, she said. Cattle don't respond well to anything else. Learned that the hard way, plenty of times over. Is that what I am? Cattle you're managing? No. Gideon met her eyes, steady, no teasing left in it now. You're the first thing in a long while I haven't wanted to manage at all. Just wanted to help. Different thing entirely. Juniper didn't answer that, but she didn't look away either. And in the firelight, with the storm still screaming faithfully against the walls, outside something settled between them that felt less like the beginning of a rescue and more like the beginning of something neither one of them had words for yet. On the third afternoon, with the wind finally beginning to lose some of its teeth, Juniper had him help her to the window instead of the fire, propped against the sill on her one good leg, staring out at a world gone entirely white and shapeless. Wind doesn't tell the truth, she said, apropos of nothing, watching a fresh gust drive snow sideways past the glass. People think it does. Think you can stand outside and feel which way trouble's coming from, same as feeling which way a river runs. But wind lies constant, Cowboy. Curls around itself. Doubles back. Tricks a man into thinking the danger's behind him when it's really sitting dead ahead, just waiting on the far side of a ridge he can't see. Then, how do you know, snow? She pointed toward a pale drift building along the fence line, visible even through the storm's thick curtain. Snow doesn't lie. Snow shows you exactly where the air slowed down, where it curled, where it finally got tired and dropped whatever it was carrying. You want to understand a storm, you don't listen to the wind. You read what it leaves behind. Gideon studied the drift she meant, turning that over slow. So the ridge out past the barn sends wind straight at the livestock most winters. Father always meant to break it somehow. Never got round to building anything proper, just patched the weak spots year after year and hoped. She looked at the drift a long moment, something calculating behind her eyes that Gideon hadn't seen from her before. Not grief, not guardedness, Just the quiet, a practical mind of someone who'd spent her whole life solving problems nobody else would solve for her. A body could build something out there. Posts and woven brush, set back far enough that the wind spends itself before it ever reaches the barn. Wouldn't stop it. Nothing stops wind, but you could teach it to lose interest before it does any real damage. Sounds like more work than one leg can manage this winter. Everything sounds like more work than one leg can manage this winter. A ghost of that dry humor again, back for just a moment. Doesn't mean it won't get done eventually. Just means it'll get done slower than I'd like. Gideon looked out at the ridge a long moment, turning the whole idea over, picturing posts and woven willow standing between the wind and everything Juniper Larkin had spent her whole life protecting alone. When the road's clear, he said slowly, I could help with that. Before I head back to the date outfit. A few days' work, at least, to get the first section started. Juniper turned to look at him, and something careful crossing her face, not suspicion exactly. Not anymore, but the particular wariness of a woman who'd learned not to let herself want things too openly, too fast. You'd do that? Build a windbreak on a stranger's land for no pay and no promise of anything after? Wouldn't call you a stranger anymore, not after everything. We've known each other 3 days. Longest 3 days of my life, though. Feels like longer. Gideon shrugged, a little embarrassed by his own honesty, and looked back out at the storm to give himself somewhere else to put his eyes. Figure that counts for something. Juniper didn't answer right away. But when Gideon glanced back at her, she was smiling small, private, the kind of smile a person keeps mostly to themselves, and looking not at him, but out at that pale ridge of drifted snow, like she was already picturing posts standing where the wind currently ran wild and unchecked. It counts for something, she said finally, quiet. Ask me again once you've actually done the work, though. Words come cheap in this basin, Cowboy. Always have, fair enough. He learned slowly that her sharpness wasn't cruelty, it was armor. Built plate by plate over years of people flinching at the sight of her, over years of a town that had decided, long before she ever did a single thing to earn it, exactly what kind of monster she must be. She learned just as slowly that his easy manner wasn't carelessness. It was a different kind of armor entirely, the kind a man builds, when he's spent his whole life leaving before anyone can leave him first. You never talk about where you're from, she said, on the third night, firelight low. Wind finally beginning to lose some of its fury against the walls. Not much to tell. That's what people say right before they tell you everything. Gideon almost smiled at that. Almost. Grew up on a ranch smaller than this one. Left when I was 17, haven't stopped moving since. Why? Because staying never seemed to suit me. He turned the coffee mug slow between his hands, not quite meeting her eyes. Every place I ever tried to plant myself, something in me started itching to leave before the roots even took. That's not an answer. That's a habit dressed up as one. Gideon huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. My father wanted a son who'd take over the ranch, marry the neighbor's daughter, die on the same 40 acres he was born on. Had the whole thing planned before I was old enough to have an opinion about it. And you didn't want that. I didn't know what I wanted. Still don't. Most days, if I'm honest. Just knew I couldn't breathe right in a life somebody else had already built the walls for. He turned the mug slower, watching steam curl up into the dark. Told him so. The week I turned 17. He told me I could leave his roof, or I could stay and do things his way. Wasn't really a choice, the way he put it, so you left. So I left. Been leaving ever since, one place at a time, until leaving stopped feeling like a decision, and just started feeling like the only thing I knew how to do. He glanced up at her, something raw and unguarded crossing his face for just a moment. Funny thing is, I never once told anybody that story straight through before. Usually just say I like moving around. Easier than the truth. Why tell me? Because you told me about the man with the shotgun offer. Seemed only fair. My mother left when I was 6, Juniper said suddenly, into the quiet that followed, like his honesty had loosened something in her she hadn't planned on sharing. Not died. Different thing. And don't let anybody in this basin tell you they're the same, because dying, at least, isn't a choice. Gideon went very still, listening. I was already taller than most grown men by 6 years old. She used to look at me like I was something that had happened to her, rather than something she'd made. Juniper's voice stayed level, careful, the voice of someone who'd told this story to herself so many times alone in the dark that it had worn smooth, lost its sharpest edges through sheer repetition. One morning she just wasn't there. Took the good horse. Left a note my father never once let me read, though I found out later it wasn't much of a note at all. Just an address in Helena and a single line about needing a life that made sense to her. I'm sorry. Don't be, I was 6. I don't remember her voice anymore. Not really. Just the shape of her turning away from me in doorways, over and over, like even standing in the same room as me cost her something she wasn't willing to keep paying. She looked at the fire a long moment. My father never once made me feel that way. Not once in 29 years did Amos Larkin look at me like I was a burden he hadn't asked for. That's the thing I miss most, I think. Not just him. The particular way he had of looking at me like I was simply his daughter, and nothing else about it needed explaining. That's a rare thing to have had, I know. Her eyes met his, something fierce and unguarded in them, which is why losing it near about broke something in me I'm still not sure has mended. Juniper studied him a long moment, firelight catching something new in her expression, not pity, Gideon noted with something like relief, because pity was the last thing he wanted from her. Recognition, maybe. The particular recognition of one person who'd spent years building walls, looking at another person who'd done the very same thing, just built out of different material. We're a strange pair, she said, softly. Said that already about the cattle. I mean it a different way this time. And now? He looked up at that. Found her watching him, firelight catching golden eyes that had spent 3 days deciding, piece by piece, whether he was worth the risk of trusting. Now Gideon said slowly, I've been sitting in one place for 3 days straight, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I haven't felt that itch once. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settles between two people who've just said something true and aren't quite sure yet what to do about it. The storm broke on the 4th morning. Gideon woke to a stillness so complete it startled him. No wind screaming against the walls, no snow hissing sideways past the shutters, just a hard bright silence, and, when he pushed the door open, a sky scrubbed pale blue from horizon to horizon, sunlight blinding off 3 days of unbroken white. Jute Basin revealed, vast, silent, beautiful in the particular brutal way that only survived storms ever are. Juniper came to the doorway behind him, leaning on a crutch he'd carved for her 2 nights back out of split cottonwood, and stood a long moment just looking out at the world the storm had left behind. I have to go, Gideon said finally. There's cattle down in the breaks I never found. A foreman who's probably decided I froze to death out here, or worse, that I ran off with wages I hadn't even earned yet. I know. I'll come back through once I've squared things. Check on the leg, you don't have to. I know that too. She's turned to look at him then, something unguarded crossing her face for just a moment, before the old armor slid back into place. Most men who say that don't mean it. I'm not most men. No, Juniper said quiet, almost to herself. I don't suppose you are. There was a moment, just before he turned for the barn, when neither of them moved. When the space between them seemed to draw tight, the way air draws tight before lightning, and Gideon felt the pull of something he didn't yet have a name for, something that had been building quietly for 3 days across a fire, across a mended fence, across a beam that nearly killed him, and a bed extended 2 feet with nothing but a bench and some borrowed quilts. He almost said something. Almost. Except the moment for it hadn't arrived yet. He could feel that too, could feel the way Juniper's whole posture had gone careful again, guarded, like she was bracing for whatever came next, the same way she'd braced beneath that fallen tree 3 days back. So he let the moment pass, because some things a man learns are worth waiting for properly, instead of rushing toward too soon and breaking before they've had the chance to become anything real. Come spring, Gideon said instead, I'll be back through. Spring's a long way off. Not so long. Basin thaws by April most years. You've been here 3 days. You don't know how this basin behaves most years. No, he agreed. But I intend to find out. She disappeared back into the cabin a moment, favoring the crutch, and came back with a small cloth bundle pressed into his hands before he could ask what it was. Dried meat. Enough for 2 days riding, if you're careful with it. She wouldn't quite meet his eyes handing it over. Don't read anything into it. I just don't like the idea of a man freezing to death 40 minutes off my property because I forgot to feed him properly before he left. Wouldn't dream of reading into it. You're reading into it right now. I can see it on your face. Maybe a little. That earned him one last laugh, small, real, gone as quick as it came, before Juniper's expression settled back into something more careful, more guarded, the armor sliding into place piece by piece the way Gideon had watched it do a dozen times over 4 strange days. Go on then, she said. before I start thinking too hard about how quiet this place is about to get again. He saddled Ruin in the thin, cold morning light, checked the cattle one final time, made sure the fire was banked high enough to last her through the day, and on his way out past the north fence line, glove brushing once more across that strange carved brand half buried in frost, he paused, looked at it a second longer than he had the first time. Something about it nagged at him. Something familiar he couldn't quite place, buried somewhere back in years he didn't much like remembering. But the sun was climbing and the trail south was long, and Gideon Cross had never in his life been a man who lingered on a feeling he couldn't name. So he let it go, swung up into the saddle, looked back once at the cabin, at the woman standing in the doorway on a crutch he'd carved for her, tall and fierce and utterly unlike anyone he'd ever met in 34 years of leaving places behind. "I'll be back," "We'll see," Juniper answered, but there was something in her voice, some small crack in all that careful armor, that sounded almost like hope. Gideon rode south into the blinding white, the basin stretching silent and endless ahead of him, and did not look back again. But he thought about her the whole way down. He thought about the way she'd hauled him out of a collapsing beam's path on a leg that should have buckled under her. He thought about a girl of 16 standing at a fence while a stranger sized up her, worth like livestock at auction. He thought about a chair turned toward a door that would never open again, and an auger nobody had touched in 2 months, and a woman who'd built a wider gate with her own 2 hands so she'd never again have to duck through a life sized for somebody else. Somewhere around the halfway point of that long ride south, Gideon Cross caught himself smiling at nothing in particular, at empty white country stretching out in every direction, and didn't bother trying to stop it. He'd meant what he said. He'd be back. He just didn't yet understand how much would be waiting for him, buried in that basin by the time he was. Winter held the basin 2 more weeks after that, indifferent, as ever, to the small stubborn thing that had taken root inside one drafty cabin during 3 days of screaming wind. Snow kept falling, in fits and starts, burying and unburying the same stretch of road a dozen times over, the way winter in Judith Basin always did, patient, relentless, entirely unconcerned with the plans of the people trying to survive it. Juniper Larkin healed slow, the way Big Bones always did, her leg mending crooked in places no doctor would ever set eyes on, because there wasn't a doctor within 40 miles willing to make that ride, for a woman the town had long ago decided wasn't quite worth the trouble. She managed anyway, she always had. She thought of Gideon Cross more than she meant to, in the quiet hours between chores, in the particular silence a cabin holds, once it's remembered what it feels like to have 2 voices in it instead of one. She told herself not to. Told herself men said things in blizzards they didn't mean once the sun came back, and the world reminded them what their real lives looked like. Told herself 3 days wasn't nearly enough to build anything worth trusting. She told herself all of that, and some nights, mostly, she almost believed it. And somewhere south of the basin, riding fence lines and counting cattle that weren't his under a sky finally clear to something like ordinary winter blue, Gideon Cross carried a small cloth bundle's memory longer than made any sense for a man who'd known a woman only 3 days. Carried the memory of a laugh that came slow and surprised and real. Carried the weight of an arm hauling him clear of a falling beam. Carried, most of all, the particular way she'd looked at that pale drift of snow along her fence line and seen not a problem, but a puzzle worth solving. He'd told her he'd be back come spring. He meant it. What neither one of them could have known, that thin gray morning he rode south and left her standing in a doorway built for a woman twice the ordinary size, was exactly how much the coming spring would cost them both to earn, or how deep the roots of that quiet carved brand, half buried in frost on a borrowed fence rail, would eventually reach into everything they were both about to build together. But that was a story for another season. For now there was only winter, and distance, and the small, stubborn certainty, carried quiet in 2 separate hearts across 40 miles of empty snow, that something worth returning to had finally, after years of neither one of them expecting it, been found. And somewhere behind him, half buried in frost on a fence rail, salvaged from land whose true owner nobody living could quite remember, a brand waited, patient, unremarked, the first small thread of a truth that would not stay buried forever. Judith Basin, April 1882. Spring didn't arrive so much as it won a fight. Snow gave up the low ground first. Dark strips of grass showing through white like bruises fading from skin, and Black Alder Creek finding its voice again after months of silence, running loud and brown and furious with melt. The basin smelled different. Mud instead of frost. Green instead of nothing. The windbreak Juniper had only imagined all winter still stood as nothing more than an idea, sketched in her own headposts not yet cut, willow not yet woven, but she'd started walking the ridge some mornings anyway, pacing off 27 feet from barn wall, picturing where the line ought to run. It gave her something to do with the restlessness that had crept in sometime around March. Something to do with her hands while the rest of her waited, on a promise she'd told herself, over and over, not to count on. Juniper stood at the fence line with a breast strap across her knees, pushing an awl through leather gone stiff with winter, and told herself the sound she heard behind her was just runoff. It wasn't runoff. Hoofbeats, 2 horses, maybe 3, coming up the basin, at a pace that wasn't quite a walk and wasn't quite a run. She kept working the awl, because getting up meant hoping, and hoping had cost her plenty over 29 years, and Juniper Larkin had promised herself back in November, the day the storm broke, the day she watched him ride south and shrink into white distance, that she wouldn't spend her spring standing at fences waiting on a man's word. She'd promised herself that. 5 months, she reminded herself. 5 months was long enough for a man to forget a face, forget a promise made in the strange suspended logic of a blizzard, forget a woman who took up more room in the world than any woman rightly should. 5 months was long enough for a lot of things to quietly stop mattering. She was still holding the promise together, barely, when ruin came around the bend, with Gideon Cross sitting tall in the saddle, and behind him a stout dun mare, and behind that a pack horse loaded down with canvas-wrapped bundles. They all stopped. Juniper stood, favoring the leg that still ached on wet days, still bent slightly wrong in a way no doctor in 40 miles had ever bothered to set right, and watched him ride the last quarter mile, like she was watching something she'd already decided not to believe in, until it was standing directly in front of her. He reached the gate. Didn't open it. Just stopped there, looking at her the way a man looks at something he's been carrying carefully across a long distance, and is only now, finally, allowed to set down. Road opened yesterday, he said. You rode fast. Wasn't racing anybody. Sure looked like it from here. Gideon's eyes flicked toward the barn, toward the fence line, toward everything that had changed since November, and away from that, quick, like he'd caught himself cataloging things he had no right to yet. You're leaner, Juniper said, studying him back. Whole basin's been hard on you, looks like. Missed a few meals here and there. Wasn't anybody around to make me eat proper. Sounds like a personal failing, not a basin failing. You wound me, you'll survive it. You survived worse under that tree. Something eased in his shoulders at that small but real, the particular ease of a man realizing the ground he's standing on is steadier than he'd feared. Whose mare? Juniper asked, nodding at the dun. Yours, if you'll have her. No, he waited. I can't pay for her. I'm not selling her. That makes it worse. Gideon said nothing to that. His eyes moved across the ranch, instead the north wall with its fresh diagonal brace, the fence rails reset along the meadow, all the small proof that Juniper Larkin had spent a whole winter refusing to fall apart without him. The place looked worn. It did not look like it had been waiting on anybody. You kept me alive, he said finally. I remembered what needed doing, different thing. The debt was paid the morning you rode up out, breathing wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere behind the gate, Ruin lowered his head and waited too, patient, like even the horse understood something important was happening and had decided not to interrupt it. All right, Gideon said. I need board for a few weeks. The mare covers part of it, supplies cover the rest. I work while I'm here, for wages, for meals, for a place to sleep that isn't a bedroll on frozen ground. Juniper studied him long enough that the dun shifted one hind foot. Impatient. This was different. Not rescue, not repayment. Work could be measured. So could feed, and lodging, and tools, and horseflesh. He won. And when the work's even, she said, you tell me. I tell you. She walked to the gate, lifted the latch, pulled it inward and stepped aside, and left room for 3 horses where there'd only ever been room enough for one woman and her grief, because that's what letting somebody in actually looked like. She was learning. Not fireworks. Not declarations. Just a gate, opened, and enough silence afterward to prove neither one of them needed to fill it with anything false. They began with the work closest at hand. The north barn brace, still holding but groaning under every fresh gust. The creek crossing, half washed out by melt. A fence section along the lower meadow that the winter had simply taken, post by post, the way winter always eventually took whatever a person hadn't reinforced twice over. None of it changed the ranch at once. Each repair just removed one problem from tomorrow's list, and Gideon began, on the third day, eyeing the ridge northwest of the barn the way a man eyes an old argument he's finally ready to have. Windbreak, he said. Like we talked about. 27 feet out, woven loose. Not tight, I remember. Good. Because everyone in this basin's going to tell you tight is stronger, and everyone in this basin is going to be wrong. They built it her way. Posts sunk deep, split willow woven with gaps, left wide enough for wind to pass halfway through and lose its temper on the other side. It was slow work, and the first evening, Gideon straightened up from the last post of the day, back aching, palms raw, and caught Juniper watching him with something that looked suspiciously like amusement. What? Nothing. You're doing that thing with your mouth. I'm not doing a thing with my mouth. You've got a whole opinion sitting right there on your face and you're not saying it. Juniper relented, the corner of her mouth finally giving into the smile she'd been holding back. I'm just remembering you told me, back in November, that half a mile through a blizzard was nothing to a man who'd chased cattle for wages that wouldn't buy a decent hat. Yet, here you are, groaning over one fence post like it personally insulted your family. Fence posts are worse than blizzards. Blizzards end. This one won't, if you keep complaining at it. I'm not complaining. I'm narrating. There's no difference, Cowboy. That earned him a real laugh, and Gideon decided, watching her walk back toward the barn, still smiling, that he could stand to lose every argument in Judith Basin if it kept sounding like that one. While they worked, days found a rhythm neither one of them had asked for, and both of them, without ever quite saying so, had started to need. Mornings, Juniper checked cattle while Gideon split poles. Afternoon, they worked fence together, her hands finding the exact angle a post wanted before her mouth ever caught up to explain it, his hands learning to read her silence the way she read snow. Evenings, tools got cleaned and hung on the same pegs, in the same order, every single night a small ritual neither of them named, because naming it might have made it fragile. One evening in early May, working the waterline together, their hands closed around the same length of pipe at the exact same moment. Neither of them moved. The creek ran loud behind them. A meadowlark called somewhere in the new grass, and Gideon Cross, kneeling in wet earth with his hand still resting over Juniper Larkin's, found himself leaning in slow, uncertain, the particular uncertain lean of a man who spent 34 years learning not to want anything long enough to lose it, until a heifer bawled somewhere past the corral, sharp and urgent, and the moment scattered like startled birds. Juniper pulled back first, cleared her throat, studied the pipe like it had personally interrupted something important, which, in its own stubborn animal way, it had. Heifers calling, she said. Heard it, you should go check. Should I? Gideon. Going, he said, and went, and neither one of them mentioned the pipe again that whole week, though both of them thought about it considerably more than either one would admit. Living alongside a woman built on Juniper's scale, Gideon was discovering, came with its own particular education. There was the matter of portions. First, Juniper ate like the rancher she was, like someone who'd spent a whole life burning more than most kitchens accounted for, and the first week Gideon cooked for both of them, he badly misjudged it, watched her push an empty plate aside, still visibly hungry, too proud to say so. You could just tell me, he said, the second time it happened, already reaching for the pan again. I don't like asking for more. You're not asking. I'm offering. Different thing entirely. You taught me that particular distinction yourself, if I recall. That got a reluctant laugh out of her, and after that he simply cooked double without being asked, and stopped commenting on it, and Juniper stopped pretending. She hadn't noticed the kindness in not commenting. Then there was the matter of his boots, which he took to leaving by the door out of habit, only to find them relocated nightly to a high shelf, safely out of reach of her own considerably larger pair. They kept getting kicked into the wood box, Juniper explained, unbothered, the third time he found them missing. Not my fault, your boots are built for a regular-sized man in a house that isn't. You could just watch where you're walking. I could. Choosing not to is more entertaining. And there was the barn door, low enough on the working side that Gideon cracked his head against the frame twice in 1 week before he finally learned to duck without thinking about it. A small, constant reminder that this whole ranch had been built, quietly and deliberately, around a woman the world had never once built anything for. You're doing it, Juniper said. The second time, he rubbed his skull and swore under his breath. That thing with your face. I'm not doing a thing with my face. You're doing the thing where you're annoyed but trying not to show it because you know I'll say something. Maybe I'm just admiring the architecture. Nobody admires a doorframe, Gideon. I admire yours. It's very sturdy, very well built, very stop talking and duck next time. He ducked next time. Mostly. The trouble started as trouble in the basin always started, in town. They rode in together the second week of May, supplies running low, coffee gone, salt needed for the herd, and Judith Basin's one dusty main street did what it had always done at the sight of Juniper Larkin. The conversation stopped, then started again, quieter, angled sideways, the particular sideways sound of people discussing a person as though that person weren't standing directly within earshot. Juniper walked through it the way she always did, spine straight, eyes forward. Gideon fell into step beside her without being asked, close enough that a person watching might have mistaken it for simple companionship and missed entirely the small, deliberate act of solidarity it actually was. You don't have to do that, she murmured, not looking at him. Do what? Walk close like you're daring somebody to say something. I'm not daring anybody to say anything. I'm just walking. You're walking like a man expecting trouble. Maybe I am. There won't be trouble. There's never trouble. Just staring and whispering, and the particular kind of silence that follows me into every room I've ever walked into since I was tall enough to be noticed. She kept her eyes forward, voice level, the practiced levelness of someone who'd long ago decided that flinching only fed the appetite. I stopped needing anybody to fight that battle for me a long time ago, Gideon. Just needed to survive it. There's a difference. I know there's a difference. He matched her pace exactly. Doesn't mean I have to like standing next to it and doing nothing. Harmon Teague's store smelled like coffee and kerosene and old debt. The storekeeper had carried the Larkin account through worse winters than this one, expecting payment after cattle sales, the way any reasonable man would. This time, though, he pushed the ledger across the counter before Juniper had even finished her list. I'll need this settled sooner, he said. No insult in it. No mention of Gideon standing 3 feet away. He didn't need to mention anything. The ledger did the talking for him. Since when? Juniper asked. Since costs changed. Teague wouldn't quite meet her eyes. Man in my position doesn't always get to choose his own terms, Miss Larkin. Juniper closed the ledger, said nothing further. Paid what she could, left the rest, and was halfway to the door when Agnes Doyle intercepted her outside, voice pitched low and concerned in the particular way that concern gets weaponized in small towns. A woman ought to think about her name, Agnes said, eyes flicking toward Gideon loading supplies onto the packsters. People talk. People always talk, Juniper said. I stopped listening years ago. That's easy to say until the talking cost you something. Which was when Juniper saw him, across the street, standing very still in a way that felt deliberate, the way a hunting animal holds still a tall man in a coat too fine for a cattle town, watching her with an expression she recognized instantly, in her stomach, before her mind had even finished cataloging his face. Arithmetic. He was doing arithmetic. She'd seen that particular stillness before. At 16, at a fence, while a man with a shotgun offer did sums in his head about her, worth measured against a season's ticket sales. Every year since, in smaller doses from men passing through who paused a beat too long outside the fence line. But she had never once, in 29 years, seen it worn so comfortably, so patiently, like a coat a man had tailored to fit exactly right and had no intention of ever taking off. He didn't approach, didn't need to. He simply watched a moment longer than any stranger should, tipped his hat with a courtesy that felt like an insult, and turned unhurried into the hotel, and Juniper stood en route to the boardwalk, old fear rising cold and familiar up through her chest, until Gideon's hand found her elbow, gentle, asking rather than taking. You know him? She asked. Never seen him before in my life, Gideon said, which was, she would learn, not entirely the truth, which was the first small crack in something that had taken all winter and half a spring to build. Gideon rode out alone 3 days later, ostensibly to collect wages still owed him from the Dade outfit. He found Warren Dade in the cattle pens, and he found, standing beside Dade, with the easy patience of a man who never hurried, because the world always eventually came to him, Silas Vane. Cross, Vane said, like they were old acquaintances resuming a conversation. Heard you'd landed at the Larkin place. Didn't expect it'd be you, of all men, sitting that close to something so valuable. Gideon's stomach dropped. Do I know you? You worked my outfit 5 years back. Broke horses. Rode fence. Vane's smile didn't reach anything behind his eyes, Quit rather sudden, if memory serves, right around the time we started clearing certain families off certain water rights. They couldn't prove on paper. I remember exactly what I quit over. Good. Then you'll appreciate that I don't hold grudges over a young man's tender conscience. Business is business, Cross. You'll learn that, or you'll spend your whole life poor and principled, which is a fine way to live if poverty ever agreed to be romantic about it. Dade shifted his weight, uncomfortable, saying nothing, and Gideon understood in that moment, with the particular clarity that comes too late to matter, exactly what kind of debt his own foreman owed this man, and exactly why nobody in this basin's cattle business seemed able to say no to Silas Vane about anything. I've got an offer, Vane went on, unbothered by the silence. For the Larkin woman, a season touring dime museums back east, good money, more than that ranch will see in 10 years of cattle prices. I'd pay you handsomely, Cross, simply to mention the opportunity to her. Man in your position, close as you are, she'd hear it better from you than from me. No, you haven't heard the figure. Don't need to. Gideon's voice came out low, dangerous, nothing like the easy drawl Juniper had learned to trust over a winter of fences and coffee. Get away from me, Vane, and stay away from her ranch. I generally get what I decide is worth the trouble, Cross. That land sits on the only reliable spring water in this stretch of the basin. That woman is worth more standing still in a tent than she'll ever be worth splitting fence rails. Sooner or later, one way or another, both of those facts are going to matter more than your feelings about them. Vane turned unhurried back toward the hotel, leaving Gideon alone with Warren Dade in the pens, and Dade wouldn't meet his eyes, wouldn't do much of anything except study the dirt between his own boots like it owed him an explanation. You knew he'd be here, Gideon said. That's why you sent word I still had wages owing. You set this up. Man like Vane doesn't ask twice, Cross. He holds paper on half this town's cattle contracts, mine included. When he says he wants a word with a former hand of his, I don't exactly have the standing to refuse him the meeting. So you sold me out for a conversation. I didn't sell anything. I just didn't warn you, which I'll grant you isn't much better. Dade finally looked up, something tired and cornered in his face. You want my advice free of charge this time? Take whatever he's offering and ride on. Whatever happens between you and that Larkin woman isn't worth what a man like Vane is capable of once he's decided he wants something. That's not advice. That's you telling me you're already beaten. Maybe I am. Man's got a family to feed and a note he can't cover if Vane calls it. Not everybody gets to be as free as you, Cross, riding in and out of towns without a single soul depending on whether you stay upright. Something about that landed harder than Gideon expected, because there was truth buried inside the excuse, even if the excuse itself didn't hold. I'm done working for you, he said. Effective now. Pay me what I'm owed or don't. Either way, I won't be back. You're throwing away steady wages over a woman you've known half a year. I'm throwing away wages that come attached to a man who lets Silas Vane use his cattle pens as a place to threaten people. Gideon swung back up into the saddle, looking down at Dade with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, some uneasy mixture of both. Good luck with your note, Warren. Hope it was worth it. Gideon didn't answer Vane's parting words at all. Turned Ruin around instead, jaw so tight it ached clear into his back teeth, and rode away before he did something with his fists that a man in his position couldn't afford. Because silence out here always eventually got filled by somebody else's version of the truth. It reached Juniper 4 days later, garbled and cruel, the way rumor always arrives. Agnes Doyle again, this time with a satisfied edge in her voice that suggested she'd been saving the story like a coin. They say Silas Vane offered your hired man money, Agnes said, to talk you into signing with his tour. Whole town's heard it by now. Man rode straight to the cattle pens to meet with him not 3 days back. Juniper found Gideon mending fence at the north line, evening light long and gold across the meadow, and something in her face when she reached him made him set the hammer down slow, careful, the way a man sets down a weapon he suddenly understands he might need to explain himself out of. You met with him, she said, flat. Not a question. I did. You didn't tell me. I was going to when? After you decided the offer for yourself. Or after you'd already turned it down and figured the whole thing wasn't worth mentioning because you'd handled it, because you always handle things, because God forbid anybody tell me the truth about my own life while it's happening instead of after. Juniper. Her voice cracked on the word, and she hated that it cracked. Hated that 4 days of rumor had done what a whole town's worth of staring never managed, gotten under the armor. She'd spent 19 years building plate by careful plate. You know what that offer means to me. You know exactly what it means. I told you about the man with the shotgun. I told you everything. And you stood across a cattle pen from Silas Vane and let him talk about me like I'm inventory. And you didn't think that was worth riding home to say out loud? I told him no, immediately, before he'd even finished the sentence. That's not the point. Then tell me the point. Gideon said, because from where I'm standing, I protected you the only way I knew how, and now I'm getting torn apart for it, same as if I'd said yes. They stood there a long moment, evening cooling fast around them, the new windbreak standing silent witness 27 feet off, and Juniper turned away first toward the ridge, toward the basin, toward anywhere that wasn't his face. I spent my whole life being managed, she said quieter now. All the fire burned down to something rawer underneath. Decided for. Protected right out of my own decisions. My father did it out of love, and it still felt like a cage some mornings. I need you to not be one more person deciding what I'm strong enough to hear. You're right. She looked back at that, surprised. You're right, Gideon said again. I should have ridden home and told you the second it happened. I was trying to protect you from something ugly, and instead I just handed you a worse version of it, secondhand, from Agnes Doyle's mouth instead of mine. That's on me. That's entirely on me. There's more, Juniper said. Isn't there? Something about you working for him. Gideon exhaled long and slow and told her everything. 5 years back, he said. 29 years old and good with horses, and Vane's outfit paid better than most, so he hadn't asked too many questions the first season. Hadn't asked when they moved fence lines overnight onto land families, had worked for a generation. Hadn't asked when Vane's lawyers arrived from Helena with paper that always, somehow favored the outfit. He'd stopped not asking the day they rode out to the Petrie place. Family with 4 kids and a mother buried on the property. Gideon said, staring at nothing, at the fence rail, at the memory itself. Vane wanted that stretch for grazing, made an offer nobody could call fair. When old man Petrie wouldn't sign, 3 of Vane's men rode out one night and burned his fence line clean to the ground. Told him next time it'd be the barn. Told him the time after that they wouldn't specify what. What happened to them? Signed within the week. Moved to Great Falls, far as I ever heard. I quit 2 days after the fire, rode off Vane's payroll with nothing but my saddle and about as much anger as a young man can carry without it eating him alive from the inside. He looked at her, something raw and ashamed, still living behind his eyes even 5 years distant from it. I told myself leaving was enough. Told myself not working for him anymore made me different from the men who lit that fire. Spent 5 years telling myself that story, right up until he stood across a cattle pen from me and called me by name like we were still on the same side of something. You're not on his side, no, but I worked for him once, and knowing that man exists, knowing exactly what he's capable of, and still not telling you the day I saw his face in town, that's its own kind of failure. Smaller than lighting a fence on fire. Still a failure. I should have told you the history the day I saw him in town, he said. Not because I owed you my past. Because you deserve to know exactly what kind of danger just looked at you across the street. Juniper listened to the whole of it without interrupting. And when he finished, the silence that followed wasn't cold anymore. Just tired. Just 2 people who'd nearly broken something worth keeping, standing close enough to feel how much it would have cost. Don't do that again, she said. I won't. I mean it, Gideon. I know I won't. She studied him, a long moment, some of the old wariness returning. But not all of it, not the kind that had first met him across a fallen cottonwood 6 months back. Then we're square. For now. They found Caleb Whitfield, 2 days later, crouched low behind the cottonwoods along the north fence, close enough to have heard every word of a private conversation that wasn't his to hear. Gideon had him by the collar before Caleb finished scrambling to his feet. Explain, Juniper said. Just that, one word. Cold enough to still the whole meadow. Caleb didn't fight the grip. Didn't try to lie either, which surprised Gideon more than anything else about the whole ugly morning. He just sagged, all the fight gone out of him at once, like a man finally setting down something too heavy to carry any further. I owe Vane money, Caleb said. 2 seasons back. Bad winter, worse spring, and he bought my note off the bank before I even knew it'd been sold. He's been asking me to watch the Larkin place ever since you 2 started working it together. Report anything. Comings, goings. Whether Gideon Cross seemed the sort to be bought. So you spied on us, Juniper said, for him. I didn't want to, Caleb's voice cracked. God help me, Juniper. I didn't want to, but a man with a note on my whole herd doesn't get to want things anymore. Ruth doesn't even know the half of what I've done to keep our place out of his hands. I couldn't bring myself to tell her either. That's not an excuse, as I know it isn't. He looked at her then, something desperate and ashamed working across his face. There's something else. Something I should have told you back in September and didn't, because I was already scared of him by then. Already in deep enough that silence felt safer than truth. The meadow went very still. Your father's death, Caleb said, wasn't an accident. Vane's men came that week not for cattle, not for land, though they wanted both eventually. They came for you. Same offer he's been making ever since, dressed up different. Amos ran them off with that shotgun of his, same as always, except this time one of them didn't run easy. There was a struggle. Amos went down hard, hit his head on the well stone. They rode off and left him there, and by the time I found the courage to check on him 2 days later, he couldn't finish it. Didn't need to. Juniper stood frozen, the whole basin gone silent around her, wind holding its breath the way it sometimes did right before it remembered how to scream. You knew, she said. All winter, all spring knew, and you let me believe he just fell. Got sick. Died quiet in a chair like an old man giving out, when the truth is somebody killed him trying to protect me. And you knew and you said nothing. I was afraid. So was I, Juniper said. Every single day since September. Difference is I didn't have the truth to be afraid of. You did. Gideon stepped closer to Caleb, voice low, and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. You've been sitting at our table eating supper with us after fence work, watching her grieve a lie you handed her, month after month, and saying nothing. I know what I am, Caleb said, and there was no defense left in him. None at all. I've known it every single night since September. I just didn't have the courage to be anything better until right now, standing here, with nothing left to protect by staying quiet. That's not courage, Juniper said. That's just running out of places to hide. Maybe it's both. Maybe a man doesn't get to choose which one it is until he's already standing in it. She turned and walked toward the barn, alone, needing distance more than she needed anyone's comfort, even Gideon's, who let her go. Understanding some grief has to be walked through solitary before it can be carried shared. Behind her, Caleb Whitfield stood in the ruined quiet of a confession, 4 seasons overdue, and Gideon looked at the fence rail 6 feet off, the same salvaged rail he'd noticed back in November, that strange carved brand half buried in frost, and understood finally exactly what he was looking at. A diamond crossed through, Vane's mark, burned into wood that had once stood as a boundary post on the very strip of contested land bordering the spring before Amos Larkin tore it down and repurposed the timber into his own fence, a small, defiant act of a man reclaiming what was his months before it cost him everything. The brand hadn't been a strange coincidence at all. It had been a warning half buried in frost since the day Gideon first rode onto this land, waiting patiently for someone to finally understand what it meant. That evening, Juniper stood at the window long after dark, watching a sky gone hard and clear with stars, and Gideon came to stand beside her, not touching, not speaking, just present in the particular way that asks nothing and offers everything. He died protecting me, she said finally. The one thing I always told myself, that he just got sick, that it was ordinary, that the world hadn't specifically decided to take him because of who I am. And now I don't even have that small mercy left. You have the truth instead. Is that supposed to be better? I don't know, Gideon admitted. But I know you're the kind of woman who'd rather have it ugly than have it false. You told me that yourself, back in November, and I've believed it ever since. Juniper was quiet a long moment, firelight from the room behind them catching gold along the edge of her jaw. Vane won't stop, she said, not now. Not with Caleb exposed, not with you refusing him twice over. He'll come again, and next time he won't send an offer. He'll send men, same as September, and this ranch doesn't have a father with a shotgun standing between it and whatever's coming. No, Gideon agreed. Look, it's got both of us instead. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had that first night by the fire, weighing a stranger's face for the particular shape of a lie and finding, once again, none. Something shifted in the space between them, then the same current that had sparked over a length of pipe weeks back, except this time neither a heifer nor good sense interrupted it. Gideon reached up slow, giving her every chance to step back, and rested his palm against her jaw, careful, like he was touching something he understood could break him far more easily than he could ever break it. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Not when it's easy. Not when it gets hard, either. I've spent my whole life leaving before anybody had the chance to leave me first. I'm done doing that. Done with it entirely, Juniper, if you'll have me. That's a big promise for a cowboy who's known me half a year. Some things don't need a long count to be true. She could have pulled away. Every old instinct in her 19 years of instinct, built plate by careful plate, told her to. Told her that wanting this openly was the fastest way to lose it, that hope this size had cost her before and would cost her again. She didn't pull away. Juniper leaned down, and Gideon leaned up, and for one long moment neither the town's judgment, nor Vane's threats, nor the ghost of a father's unfinished grief existed anywhere at all, just firelight, and stars through the window, and a kiss slow enough to feel like an answer to a question neither of them had dared ask out loud until now. When they finally broke apart, Juniper's breath came unsteady, her forehead resting against his. "Well," she said, "that's inconvenient." "Is it? Everything about caring for somebody is inconvenient, cowboy. You'll learn that quick enough if you stick around. Good thing I already told you I'm not going anywhere." She smiled then, the real one, the one she'd once kept hidden from a whole basin's worth of strangers, and pressed one more kiss, brief and certain, to the corner of his mouth before stepping back to let the moment settle into something steadier. "Both of us," Juniper repeated, like she was testing the weight of the phrase, deciding whether it could hold what was coming. That night, after Juniper had finally gone still with sleep by the fire, exhausted past even nightmares, for once Gideon sat alone checking the rifle Amos Larkin had left hanging above the mantel, untouched since September, same as everything else in this cabin that grief had left frozen in place. He loaded it, set it within reach of the door. Because if Vane sent men again the way Caleb said he had in September, Gideon intended for this ranch to answer differently than it had the last time. Intended to be standing between whatever came through that gate and the woman sleeping 12 feet away, and intended, this time, to still be standing when it was over. He thought of the windbreak standing 27 feet off in the dark, doing exactly what Juniper had designed it to do, not stopping the wind, just teaching it to lose interest somewhere less costly. He wondered, staring at the rifle in his hands, whether the same principle might somehow apply to a man like Vane. Whether there was a way to make him wear himself out against something built to absorb it, rather than meeting him head on and hoping raw force alone would be enough. He didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time since riding into this basin half a year back, Gideon Cross understood with total clarity exactly what he was staying for, and exactly what he was willing to lose: sleep, wages, and if it came to it, blood, in order to protect. Vane came himself 6 days later, riding up the basin road with 2 men flanking him, and the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life needed to knock. Juniper saw him coming from the porch and didn't move to meet him at the gate. Let him ride the whole distance under her gaze instead. Let him feel, for once, the particular weight of being watched by someone who refused to flinch first, Miss Larkin. Vane reined up outside the fence, hat tipped with that same insulting curtsy from the street. "Lovely spread you've built back up. Shame what winters do to a place left too long without proper investment. State your business, or ride on. Straight to it. I respect that." Vane's eyes moved across the yard, the windbreak, the mended barn, the rifle Gideon wore openly at his hip for the first time since April, cataloging it all with the same cold precision she'd watched him perform on the street. "I understand my last offer was declined. I've come to offer better terms myself, in person, out of respect for a woman who clearly doesn't care to be spoken for. You're not offering me respect. You're offering me a tent and a ticket price. I'm offering you security. This basin isn't kind to a woman alone, whatever help she's managed to hire on. Water rights get contested, debts get called. Neighbors get frightened off by talk they can't control." He let that sit a moment. "Deliberate. Accidents happen, even to careful men. Your father learned that." Gideon's hand moved to the rifle before Vane finished the sentence. "Say that again," Gideon said low, "and see what happens." Vane didn't flinch. Men like him rarely did. Juniper was learning they simply recalculated, adjusted the angle of approach, and came again from somewhere softer. "I'm simply observing," Vane said, "that this basin has a long memory for families who don't know when to accept a generous hand. I'd hate to see that memory repeat itself on land I've come to admire so genuinely." "Get off my property," Juniper said. Her voice didn't shake. Hadn't shaken once the whole conversation, and she found some fierce private satisfaction in that fact, even through the fear coiling cold beneath her ribs. "You'll get no offer accepted here. Not this season. Not any season. And if your men come back the way they came in September, they'll find this gate a good deal better defended than they left it. Something flickered behind Vane's eyes, not fear, not quite, but the particular recalculation of a man realizing a piece on the board had moved somewhere he hadn't accounted for. Bold words, he said, for a woman relying on one cowboy's rifle and a fence made of sticks. Bold words, Juniper answered, from a man who needed two others to watch his back, just to deliver a threat to a woman standing on her own land. Vane's jaw tightened, the first genuine crack Juniper had seen in his composure since the moment she first spotted him across the street. He said nothing further, simply turned his horse, unhurried, refusing to let the retreat look like one, and rode back down the basin road, with his two men trailing silent behind him. Neither Gideon nor Juniper moved until the riders had shrunk to nothing against the horizon. He'll come back, Gideon said finally. Men like that don't ride away because they lost an argument. They ride away to plan a better one. I know. Juniper's hands had curled into fists at her sides without her quite noticing, and she made herself unclench them, made herself breathe, let him plan. We'll be ready this time. That's the whole difference between September and now. Is it enough? She looked at him, really looked. The particular look she'd learned to give only him, the one that carried no armor left in it at all. It has to be, she said, because I'm not running, Gideon. Not from this land, not from this ranch, not from anything my father died defending. Whatever's coming, it finds me standing right here. Then it finds both of us. Standing here outside. The basin lay quiet under new grass and old grief, spring settling deeper into ground that had buried more than one kind of truth that season, and somewhere south, past the ridge, past the reach of any windbreak either of them had yet built strong enough, Silas Vane was already making his next move. Winter would return to Judith Basin eventually. It always did. What neither Gideon nor Juniper yet understood was that when it came again, it wouldn't be weather they'd have to survive. It would be him. Judith Basin, late October 1882. Summer had come and gone the way summers in Montana always did, too fast, too generous, gone before a person finished trusting it, and Juniper Larkin spent the last warm weeks of that year doing the only thing she knew how to do with dread. She worked. The windbreak stood, finished now, full 27 feet of woven willow, running the whole length of the ridge, and Caleb Whitfield had ridden past it twice that autumn, slow, studying the gaps the way he'd once studied them, with a laugh he didn't have left in him anymore. He'd laughed at it once, back in the spring, called it half a wall, and asked why she'd left so much wind sitting right there in the gaps. He'd said it the way half the basin still said things about her, certain, careless, never once considering he might be wrong. Juniper remembered watching him pace from barn to willow. That day, counting under his breath like a man checking somebody else's arithmetic for the pleasure of catching an error. He'd found none. He just hadn't understood yet what he was looking at. He didn't laugh now, just looked and nodded once, and rode on toward whatever penance a man pays, a basin that's decided to forgive him slower than he'd like. Because forgiveness, Juniper had learned over one long strange year, wasn't a door that opened all at once. It was a gate you propped a little wider every week, and trusted, and sometimes got burned for trusting, and propped open again anyway the next morning out of sheer stubborn refusal to let fear build all the fences. Gideon worked beside her through all of it. Hadn't left once. Not for the date outfit, not for anywhere, had simply stayed. The way a man stays when staying has finally stopped feeling like something he needed to be talked into. You've gone somewhere else, he said, one gray afternoon in late October, watching her stare out past the windbreak toward the ridge. Your hands are still stacking hay. The rest of you isn't here at all. Juniper set down the pitchfork. Storm season's coming. I know, last November. I know that too. She looked at him, something old and tired and afraid moving behind her eyes. Vane hasn't shown his face since June. Doesn't mean he's given up. Men like that don't give up. They just wait for weather. That makes it easier to finish what they started. Then we make sure the weather doesn't help him. You can't outplan a blizzard, Gideon. No. He looked toward the windbreak, toward the barn, toward everything they'd built together with their own hands. But you taught me something, back in April. Wind doesn't stop. You just teach it to lose interest somewhere. It doesn't cost you anything important. That was about weather. Maybe it's about more than weather. Juniper didn't answer that. But that night, for the first time in months, she slept without dreaming of a fence post half buried in frost, of a name carved into wood, of a father's hand reaching for a shotgun he'd never once needed to load until the one time it mattered most. November crept closer the way it always did in the basin, not gradually, but all at once. A single hard morning, where the air simply changed character and everyone within 40 miles felt it in their joints before they saw it in the sky. Juniper spent those last mild days doing everything a person could think to do against a threat that refused to announce its own timing. She rode the fence line twice daily instead of once, checking every post Gideon had driven, every brace, every place the wind had ever found weak in years past. She counted cattle obsessively, moved the weaker stock closer to the barn earlier than she ever had before, and caught herself, more than once, standing at the window past midnight, watching a horizon that gave nothing away. "You should sleep," Gideon told her, one such night, finding her there in the dark. "Can't. Worrying at it doesn't make it come slower. I know that." She didn't look away from the window. "Doesn't stop me doing it anyway." He didn't argue further. Just stood beside her a long while, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, and eventually Juniper found that his presence did what her own vigilance never could, let something in her chest loosen enough. Finally, to sleep. They practiced too, in the weeks before the storm, not soldiers drilling for war, nothing so formal as that, but two people quietly rehearsing the geography of their own defense. Gideon walked the property with the rifle, learning every angle a man might use to approach unseen. Juniper mapped, out loud, every place the windbreak's engineered drifts would eventually pile deep enough to slow a rider, every stretch of open ground that offered no such mercy. "If they come from the road," she said one crisp October afternoon, tracing the fence line with one finger, "they'll hit the ridge first. Wind catches wrong there. Always has, and if they know that, if they come around it instead, then they're riding through open pasture with no cover at all, in a blizzard, hoping to find a cabin they can barely see." Juniper looked at him, something grim and steady in her expression. "There's no clever way around weather, Gideon. That's the whole point of building something that works with it instead of against it." The blizzard hit on the 11th of November, almost a year, to the week, since a stranger had heard her screaming under a fallen cottonwood and decided, against every ounce of good sense, to ride toward the sound instead of away from it. The wind came off the ridge first, before the snow. Before anything, the same particular pressure against the back of the neck, the same bruised purple sky pressing down over the basin, like all lid finally closing on a pot that had simmered a whole year too long. Juniper felt it before she saw it. Felt it in her bones, in the old ache of a leg that had never quite healed straight, in some animal certainty that had nothing to do with almanacs or instinct and everything to do with a year spent waiting for exactly this. "It's coming tonight," she said. Gideon didn't argue. Just started moving, tightening the willow lashings on the windbreak, clearing both access points along the waterline, stretching a fresh rope between cabin and barn, with hands that had learned, over one long year, exactly how much a rope like that could matter. "You think he'll come with it?" Juniper said. Not quite a question. "I think a man like Vane doesn't waste a storm this size on subtlety. If he's coming tonight, under cover of weather that'll make it easy to claim afterward that whatever happened here was just an accident. Same story he told about your father. Then we don't give him an accident to hide behind." "No," Gideon agreed. "We give him a fight he didn't plan for." The wind hit full force just after dark. It hammered the basin the way it always did, indifferent, relentless, entirely unconcerned with the small, stubborn lives trying to survive underneath it, and Juniper stood at the window a long moment, watching snow race sideways past the glass, before a different sound cut through the storm's steady howling. Hoof beats, fast, wrong. Because horses moving that fast in weather this bad meant either desperation or intention, and Juniper Larkin had learned, over one hard year, never to assume desperation first. Gideon was already at the door, rifle in hand, when the shape resolved out of the white one-rider, alone, driving his horse hard toward the gate, with the particular urgency of a man who'd rather die of exposure than arrive too late. "It's Caleb," Juniper said. Startled it was. He half fell from the saddle at the gate, snow crusted thick on every inch of him, and didn't wait for greeting before the words tumbled out ragged and desperate. "Vane's men. 6 of them, maybe 7, riding for your place right now, using the storm, same as September. They mean to force you off tonight, one way or another, and I couldn't." He stopped. Started again. "I couldn't let it happen twice. Not again. Not while I stood by and did nothing a second time. Why should we believe you?" The words came out of Juniper, sharper than she meant them. Old fear and fresh danger tangling together in her chest, until she couldn't tell which was talking. "You don't have to believe me," Caleb said. Just let me help. Let me stand somewhere useful for once in my whole cowardly life and judge me after, if there's an after left to judge me in." Gideon looked at Juniper. Juniper looked at the storm, at the man half collapsed against her gate, at a year's worth of careful, hard-won trust standing on a knife's edge in the howling dark. "Inside," she said finally. "Get warm, then get armed. We don't have time to argue about redemption tonight." The hour that followed stretched long and strange, the three of them positioned at different windows watching a white, nothing that could have been hiding anything or nothing at all. Juniper's mind kept circling back, unbidden, to September of the year before. A month she hadn't lived through herself in any conscious sense, only inherited secondhand from Caleb's broken confession, and yet some nights it felt more vivid to her than memories she'd actually earned. Her father alone, facing men who'd come to take his daughter the way other men came to take cattle or timber or water rights. Fighting with a shotgun he'd carried for 20 years and never once needed to fire in earnest. Dying on frozen ground because he loved her too much to let her be taken quietly. Because if he'd survived that night, she thought, gripping the rifle Gideon had shown her how to hold properly, if he'd only survived it, none of the rest of this would have needed happening at all. She wouldn't have spent a year grieving a lie. Wouldn't be standing here now in another blizzard, waiting for the same evil to finish what it started, except he hadn't survived it. And she was standing here now regardless, because the story didn't stop just because one chapter of it had gone unbearably wrong, and Juniper Larkin had learned, over one long hard year, that the only real choice left to a person after tragedy was what they built in the space it left behind. "Where'd you go?" Gideon murmured, low, from the window beside her. "I'm thinking about my father," I figured. He didn't press further. Just reached over, briefly, and pressed his hand flat against hers on the windowsill, not holding, just present. The particular steadiness of a man who understood some fear didn't need fixing, only company. They came in hour-later shapes in the white six of them, exactly as Caleb had warned, riding hard for the gate with the particular confidence of men who'd done this before and expected this time to go just as easily. It didn't, because the windbreak did exactly what Juniper had spent a whole year building it to do. The riders came in fast along the ridge, the way any sensible approach would run, and the wind curling, doubling back, exactly the way she'd always said it would caught them broadside. The moment they cleared the tree line, driving snow so thick and so sudden that two horses reared outright, throwing their riders into drift already 3 feet deep. "Now," Gideon said, and Juniper didn't need telling twice. She came around the barn's edge like something the storm itself had built specifically to answer this exact threat, tall as any two of Vane's men stacked together, moving with a speed and certainty that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with knowing, bone deep, every single inch of the land she was fighting for. One rider swung a rifle toward her. Never got the chance to fire it. She closed the distance before he'd finished the motion, closed one massive hand around the barrel, and simply wrenched it sideways, not violence exactly. More like correction, the particular firm redirection a person uses on something dangerous that's forgotten its proper place, and the rifle went spinning off into snow that swallowed it whole. "Get off my land," Juniper said. Her voice carried the way it always had, the way it had never once needed raising to be heard. "All of you now. While you've still got the chance to leave under your own power." Some of them ran, turned their spooked horses back toward the road without a second thought, more afraid of the storm and the woman both than any wage Vane was paying them to be there. Two didn't. One came at Gideon from the side, half hidden by blowing snow, and Gideon heard him a half second before he saw him. Years of trail work, teaching a man to trust his ears when his eyes failed him, and turned just in time to catch a fist aimed for his jaw on his forearm instead. The impact still staggered him. He answered with one of his own, square honest. The particular blow of a man who'd spent a whole year with something worth protecting and had run entirely out of patience for anyone threatening it. The rider went down into the drift and didn't get back up in any hurry. The second man made straight for Caleb, recognizing him even through the storm, snarling something about traitors and turncoats that the wind tore apart before it finished forming, and Caleb Whitfield, who had spent a year being exactly the kind of man that accusation described, found something in himself he hadn't known was still there. He caught the man's charge, wrestled him sideways into the fence line, and held him there shaking, breathless, disbelieving his own courage even as he used it. Not this time. Caleb's low, mostly to himself. Not again. Silas Vane arrived last, exactly as a man like him always would after the danger, close enough to claim victory, far enough back to claim innocence if the danger won instead. He sat his horse just beyond the gate, watching his men scatter and fall and fail against a defense he clearly hadn't budgeted for, and something in his face some crack Juniper had only glimpsed once before. Back in May, standing this same ground had widened now into something closer to genuine alarm. "This isn't finished," Vane called, over the wind. "Like this doesn't stay contested forever, Miss Larkin." "One way it's finished," Juniper said. "Tonight. Right now. I have a witness to what your men did in September." Silas Vane. "A witness willing to say it out loud in front of a judge. And I have a whole ranch full of proof that you've spent 2 seasons trying to take by force what you couldn't take by law. Ride away tonight or ride into a fight you're going to lose considerably worse than this one." Vane's horse shifted, spooked by the wind, and for one long moment nobody moved, the whole scene suspended in howling white, like the storm itself was waiting to see how the story ended. Then from somewhere past the ridge, a new sound cut through everything, a man's voice, thin and desperate, calling for help in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with genuine terror. One of Vane's fallen riders. Trapped, Juniper realized, listening, trapped somewhere, out past the windbreak, in the exact stretch of drift the structure had been built to create, buried deep enough that panic alone wouldn't dig him free. Gideon looked at her. She looked back, because there was a version of this night where they simply let him lie there, let the storm finish what Vane's own greed had started, let nature hand down whatever judgment it wanted on a man who'd ridden onto their land intending to steal a life by force. That version would have been easy. Nobody in the whole basin would have blamed them for it. "We have to get him," Juniper said. "I know," Gideon answered, already moving. They found him 20 feet past the windbreak's edge, buried to the chest, one arm bent wrong beneath him, face gone, the particular gray of a man who understood exactly how close he'd come to dying for another person's ambition. "Please," he said, when Juniper's shadow fell over him. "Please, I didn't want any of this. He pays better than honest work, and I've got a wife expecting our 2nd child. I never wanted to hurt anybody. Please stop talking," Juniper said, "and let me dig." She dug, hauled him free with the same massive, careful strength she'd used on a stranger under a fallen cottonwood 1 year before, and something in the man's face as she lifted him clear of the drift cracked wide open. Not gratitude exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become it, given time. Because that was the whole difference. Juniper understood, kneeling in the snow with a man who'd ridden onto her land to help destroy everything she loved, now shaking apart in her arms. The whole difference between becoming what Vane had made of himself and staying whoever she'd decided a long time back she was always going to be. Vane watched all of it from beyond the gate, watched his own man saved by the very woman he'd sent men to steal, and something in his composure, the last of it, the final careful plate of armor he'd worn his whole cruel life, finally cracked all the way through. "You're a fool," he called, voice thin against the wind. "Mercy doesn't win against men like me." "Maybe not," Juniper called back, "but it's going to outlast you." "That's a different kind of winning, Silas Vane, and it's the only kind I've ever actually wanted." He didn't answer that. Simply turned his horse the same unhurried, dignity-preserving retreat he'd performed back in May, except this time the storm didn't allow for dignity. His horse fought the wind hard, staggered once in a drift he clearly hadn't accounted for, and Vane rode off into howling white with considerably less grace than he'd arrived with, disappearing south into a night that had, for once, decided to be on somebody else's side. He wasn't seen in Judith Basin again. The storm broke 2 days later, same as it always eventually did, leaving behind a world scrubbed white and silent and strange. Juniper stood in the doorway of her own cabin full height, no ducking, and let herself, for the first time in a year, simply breathe. "We made it," she said, like she was testing whether the words could be trusted. "We made it," Gideon agreed, "but it isn't over, not yet." Caleb sat slumped against the barn wall nearby, exhausted past speech, and the rescued rider arm splinted now, with the same rough competence Gideon had once used on Juniper's own leg, watched them both with an expression that hadn't fully settled yet into anything nameable. "Why," the man finally asked, voice hoarse, "did you dig me out? After everything? After what we came here to do?" Juniper looked at him a long moment. "Because my father taught me the difference between defending something and becoming cruel to do it," she said. "I'm not interested in losing that difference just because a man like Vane never had it to begin with." The man had nothing to say to that, just looked down at his splinted arm, and then out at the ranch he'd ridden onto intending harm, and something in his face suggested the lesson had landed considerably deeper than any sermon ever could have managed. Whether the storm finished what his own men's testimonies started, or whether he simply understood a defeat when the whole basin witnessed one, nobody could say for certain. What mattered, in the weeks that followed, was that Caleb Whitfield rode to the county seat the moment roads cleared and gave a full accounting of September, of the debt, of every ugly thing he'd seen and stayed silent about for a whole year too long, and that the rescued man, once his arm had healed and his conscience had caught up with his fear, gave testimony of his own that matched it detail for detail. Word came back slow, the way news always traveled through the basin in winter, carried by whoever happened to ride through, with a newspaper folded in their saddlebag, passed hand to hand until it reached whoever needed it most. Silas Vane, it turned out, had been arrested in Helena not 3 weeks after that blizzard, caught trying to sell off a note portfolio built from a dozen small ranchers' desperation before word of Judith Basin could catch up with him. The charges piling up around him: extortion, assault, and a growing list of testimonies from families he'd pushed off land over the better part of a decade were, according to the paper, likely to keep him occupied with lawyers for a very long time. Justice, Gideon said, reading the notice aloud by the fire, moves slower than storms. But it does move. Slow's fine, Juniper answered, so long as it arrives. Harmon Teague, questioned about the note Vane had bought off the bank, produced records nobody had ever thought to ask him for. Agnes Doyle, of all people, told a county investigator that she'd personally witnessed Vane watching Juniper Larkin's property with what she called, in her own careful phrasing, an interest no decent man ought to carry toward another person's land or another person's life. Warren Dade sold his outfit that winter and left the basin entirely, unwilling or unable to face a county investigator with questions about how long he'd known what Vane was doing with the paper he held. Nobody chased him for it. A man who'd already lost his nerve once wasn't worth the trouble of losing it publicly a second time. The basin slowly began telling a different story about Juniper Larkin. Not the story of a curiosity to be stared at across a street. The story of a woman who'd stood her ground in a blizzard and pulled a stranger's man out of a snowdrift with her own 2 hands, asking could nothing return but the simple decency of being left alone. It wasn't universal, that new story. Some folks kept their old opinions the way people keep old worn thin, uncomfortable, but familiar enough not to bother replacing. Juniper had stopped expecting universal a long time ago, and found Pawnawind, to her own quiet surprise, that she didn't need it anymore. Enough had changed. Enough was true. The rest could take whatever time it needed. She ran into Agnes Doyle at Teague's store that January, both of them reaching for the same sack of flour, and braced herself out of old habit for whatever sideways comment might follow. None came. "I owe you an apology," Agnes said instead, stiff, clearly unused to the shape of the words in her own mouth. "I spent years treating your size like it was something you'd chosen to inconvenience the rest of us with. Watching. And you stand in that blizzard digging a man free who came to hurt you. That's not a woman who owes this town's opinion one more minute of her attention." "No," Juniper agreed, not unkindly. "It isn't. I don't expect that to undo anything. It doesn't. But I noticed you said it anyway." Juniper hefted the flour sack, testing its weight. "That's more than most manage, Agnes. I'll take it for what it is." Agnes nodded, something loosening in her shoulders, and the 2 women parted without another word needed between them, which was, Juniper reflected on the ride home, its own quiet kind of miracle, coming from a town that had spent 19 years needing plenty of words to say considerably less. A traveling man came through that same February, dusty coat, easy smile, the particular practiced charm of someone who made his living talking strangers into things they hadn't planned on agreeing to. He found Juniper at the fence, much the way that first man had found her at 16, and opened with a compliment about her remarkable stature that he clearly imagined was original. "I represent a touring exhibition," he began, "and I believe a woman of your unique—" "No," Juniper said before he'd finished the sentence, the word arriving without any of the old cold dread that used to accompany it. Just simple, flat, entirely unbothered certainty. "You haven't heard the terms. Don't need—" "I've heard this particular offer more times than I care to count. Dressed up in more costumes than you've likely got in that wagon. The answer's the same every time. No. A woman in your position is standing on her own land, beside a man who'd escort you off it personally if I asked him to, with a whole basin's worth of neighbors who'd back him up on it. Juniper studied the stranger a moment longer, something almost like pity flickering behind her steady gaze. Whatever you're selling, mister. I stopped being for sale a long time before you rode up that road. Try the next town. I hear there's no shortage of desperate men running tent shows this season. The man left without further argument, and Juniper stood at the fence a moment after he'd gone, turning over the strange, quiet triumph of a conversation that would have once cost her a sleepless week, and now cost her nothing at all, just a few minutes. A flat no, and the simple certainty of a woman who finally fully belonged to herself. Caleb Whitfield spent that whole winter making amends the only way that ever really counts, not with words, but with work. He rebuilt a section of Larkin fence he'd once let stand weak out of fear. He rode for supplies when the roads allowed it, refused payment every single time, and one gray February afternoon, standing at the gate with his hat in his hands, said the only thing that had ever actually needed saying. "I'm sorry," Caleb said, "for all of it. Watching the silence, the year I let you believe a lie, because I was too much of a coward to hand you some true. I know," Juniper said. "That's all, just I know. What else is there? You can't undo it. You can only keep showing up different than you were, and so far, that's exactly what you've done." She studied him a long moment, some of the old wariness finally fully gone. "My father used to say a man's apology is worth exactly as much as what he does the next morning. You've had a whole winter of next mornings, Caleb. I noticed every single one." He nodded, throat working, and rode off toward his own place, with something looser in his shoulders than Juniper had seen there in over a year. On a mild March afternoon, with the worst of winter finally loosening its grip, Juniper walked out to the small rise behind the barn where her father lay buried. Gideon a few steps behind her, quiet, giving her whatever room she needed to take. She hadn't visited much that past year, hadn't trusted herself to, not while the official story of his death still sat between them like unfinished business, a lie she'd been unknowingly carrying to his own grave every time she came to grieve him. "I know now," she said, kneeling in half-thawed ground beside the marker. "Everything. What really happened. Why you never came back in for supper that night." Her voice caught, steadied, kept going. "I spent a whole year being angry at you for dying so ordinary, so quiet, like the world just decided you'd used up your time. Turns out you didn't go quiet at all. You went down fighting for me, same as you'd have done any day of your whole life, and I'm sorry it took me this long to know that properly." The wind moved soft through the new grass, nothing like the screaming fury of the blizzard 2 months back, just an ordinary spring wind, indifferent and gentle both. "I married him, Papa," Juniper said, glancing back once at Gideon, who stood a respectful distance off, hat in hand. "Well, I'm going to, come May. He built me a bench for my feet the first night I met him, and never once made me feel like I was too much of anything to be worth the trouble. I think you'd have liked him. I think you already told me so that first winter, and I only understood it just now." She stayed a long while longer, saying nothing further out loud, and when she finally rose and turned back toward the cabin, something in her chest had settled that had been unsettled for a year and a half, not gone. Grief never fully went anywhere. She was learning, but changed. Lighter, carried instead of dragged. Spring came slow that year, the way it always did, snow releasing the basin inch by grudging inch, and on a clear morning in early April, almost exactly 18 months since a stranger had ridden toward a scream instead of away from it. Gideon stood at the cabin's east wall, with a small wagon load of fresh lumber stacked beside him, studying the ground beneath the window like it held an answer he'd been circling toward for a long time. "When it thaws proper," he said, "I want to widen every door in this house." Juniper looked up from the harness she was mending. "Every door. Every single one. Front door, barn side, all of it built right this time. Built for you, instead of built for whoever happened to swing a hammer first, and never once considered a person your size might need to live here too. That's a lot of work for a man who doesn't own this ranch. I know. You'd be putting real effort into something that isn't yours. I know that too." Gideon set down the board he'd been holding and crossed the yard and stood in front of her with something steady and unguarded in his face that Juniper had learned, over 18 months, meant he'd finally worked his way through to the truth of something. "Unless it could be. Mine, I mean. Ours. If I build every door in this house wide enough to walk through without ducking for the rest of your life, I'd rather do it as your husband than as your hired hand." There was no kneeling, no speech rehearsed for the occasion. Just a cowboy standing in mud-seasoned sunlight, holding a board in one hand and his whole uncertain heart in the other. waiting to find out whether 18 months had built something strong enough to last. Juniper set down the harness. "Square the foundation before you start," she said. "You're not doing this halfway, Cowboy." "Not the doors, and that a yes?" "That's a yes." Gideon kept his word about the doors and then some. Through the last cold weeks of April, he worked the frame of the cabin's front entrance wider, then taller, squaring fresh lumber against a house that had spent 19 years telling one particular woman, in 100 small silent ways, that she'd been built the wrong size for her own home. He rebuilt the barnside gate too, though it had never truly needed it, simply because Juniper mentioned once, in passing, that she liked the symmetry of matching doors. The day he finished, he stood back and studied his work with the particular satisfaction of a man who understood exactly what he was actually building. "Well?" he asked, as Juniper walked through the new front door, without once turning sideways, without once ducking, for what he suspected was the first time in her whole adult life on this land. She stopped in the middle of the doorway, stood there a long moment, feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of a house finally fitting her the way a house should fit anyone. "It's straight," she said, voice rougher than she meant it to sound. "Every line. You didn't just widen it. You made it right. Seemed worth doing right if I was doing it at all." Juniper didn't have words for what she felt standing there, so she didn't reach for any, just crossed the threshold again, and again, back and forth, 3 times 4, until Gideon started laughing at her, and she found herself laughing too, both of them standing in a doorway that had finally stopped being an apology and started being simply, correctly, home. They married in May, quiet, in front of the cabin she'd once believed she'd finish out her life alone in. Caleb and Ruth Whitfield stood as witnesses. Half the basin came, curious or genuine or some mixture of both, and Juniper found, standing in front of all of them, in a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric that actually fit, that she didn't much care anymore which half of the crowd was which. There was no elaborate ceremony. Just a circuit preacher who happened through at the right time, a yard full of new grass, and 2 people who'd already survived considerably harder things than a few dozen watching eyes. "I take you, Juniper," he said. When it came time, voice steady despite the wind trying its best to steal it, "not because you need protecting, you've made plenty clear you never did, but because I'd rather spend every storm this basin throws at us standing beside you than anywhere else on earth, doing anything else at all. I, Juniper, take you, Gideon," she answered, and found, to her own surprise, that her voice didn't shake either, "because you saw me exactly once, under a fallen tree in a blizzard, and never once needed convincing after that to see me plainly for the rest of your life. That's rarer than this whole basin knows to be grateful for. I intend to be grateful for it every single day we've got left." The preacher pronounced them married. Somebody in the crowd cheered Caleb, probably, though Juniper never confirmed it, and Gideon Cross kissed his wife in front of half of Judith Basin without a trace of the hesitation that had once kept both of them circling each other for the better part of a year. Summer settled over the ranch, the way summer always eventually did, generous and brief, and Juniper let herself do something she'd never once, in 30 years, allowed. She rested. Evenings on the porch beside her husband, the basin gold with late light, no dread waiting behind her ribs, no eyes doing sums against her from across the street. Gideon admitted, one such evening, that he hadn't felt the old itch to move on even since that first November, that he'd simply been waiting all those restless years to find the right place to stand still. Juniper called it disgustingly sentimental for a cowboy who'd once threatened to leave her under a tree. He said he never threatened any such thing. She let him have it. Winter returned to Judith Basin that November, same as it always did, patient and relentless and entirely unconcerned with the small stubborn lives it had once tried so hard to break. Juniper banked the stove before bed the way she had 100 times before, and checked the shutters, and ran her fingers along the northwest sill, for any draft the new ceiling might have missed. 2 coats hung at the door now, wide enough to fit through it without turning sideways. Gideon's gloves dried on a peg beneath the rope they still, out of habit more than necessity, kept strung between cabin and barn every storm season. Her father's chair sat by the fire now, instead of angled toward the door. She'd moved it herself back in June. No ceremony to it, just picked it up one ordinary afternoon and turned it toward the warmth instead of the waiting. Because some griefs, she'd learned, don't need a permanent shrine. They just need somewhere honest to sit. The auger still rested on the workbench where Amos Larkin had left it. That, she never moved. Some things earned their permanence. Outside, wind pressed against walls that had survived considerably worse than weather. The windbreak stood dark and patient against the last gray light, doing exactly what it had always done, not stopping anything, just teaching the world's harder edges to spend themselves somewhere that didn't cost her everything. Gideon crossed the room and nudged a fresh log toward the hearth with his boot. Juniper poured coffee into one mug, then another, and she set the second one on the table, across from her own, the way she had on countless ordinary evenings this past year, and this time the way she had every single time since a cowboy first taught her that some kindnesses only take the deciding, not the earning. She didn't think twice about it at all. Outside, the storm settled in for the night, screaming against walls. Two people had built strong enough, together, to finally stop being afraid of it. And somewhere in that howling dark, if a person listened close enough, they might have heard something underneath the wind that sounded almost like peace.